No. Participants. Okay. Going to mute all. I'm going to click record. Record on this computer. Share screen. All right. Welcome to this exciting Yom Iyun about Techeiles. I'm Rafi Hecht, your event coordinator. My first exposure to Techeiles was in the mid-90s when I saw, at the time, a kid wearing Rambam Techeiles strings and tying. He told me about this discovery that a young organization researched and found involving a sort of snail. My primary personal hang-up was, where are the mainstream Gedolim? Second to that was the financial expense as well as sticking out socially. But I simply just didn't know and figured that on one hand, if mainstream Gedolim aren't wearing it, then that's enough of a reason not to. But on the other hand, wearing a psil Techeiles on the kanaf is a direct mitzvah min haTorah. But I wasn't about to do something without seeing or knowing mainstream Gedolim, whose names I personally recognized, wearing it, especially since we lost a direct Masorah for this. Where were the Gedolim and why were they seemingly keeping quiet? A little over 3 years ago, I went with my family for a long overdue trip to Israel. One day we hired a from tour guide and we're passing Ma'ale Adumim. I asked him if that's where Ptil Techeiles was located, and he responded yes, that there was no downside to wearing at most a colored string. After over 20 years being on the fence, I decided to buy a talis with Techeiles and put it aside while researching the sugya as well as where the mainstream Gedolim were. Worst case, I would change the strings for all white ones and cut my losses. Needless to say, I wasn't disappointed. And after a little over a month, I made the personal, financial, and emotional effort to obtain and wear Techeiles as frequently as possible. While for me it meant socially sticking out, it eventually became second nature. Today, I run a website called Blue Fringes. I'm self-promoting here, which among other things has a list of Gedolim wearing Techeiles, and where possible, I include pictures of them wearing it, as well as their shitos of string ratio and tying method. I also run an active social group of over 660 Techeiles enthusiasts from all backgrounds and perspectives, where healthy dialogue is exchanged. I also feel privileged to be in direct touch with Rabbanim and scientists who ask virtually any question about this topic. 4 of them will be speaking tonight. Dr. Yisrael Zeiderman, followed by Rabbi Chaim Twersky, followed by Rabbi Yehoshua Yankelowitz, and last but certainly not least, Rabbi Ben-Zion Halberstam, who will be finishing off the event. Each speaker has been an early adopter of Techeiles and is a top-level authority in this field. For this event, there will be a Dvar Bracha from Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, followed by a 7.5-minute video by Ptil Techeiles on why it took so long to rediscover Techeiles. This will then be followed with an intro to each speaker. After each speaker speaks, 3 to 5 minutes will be given for questions. Questions will be asked by typing into the comments section in Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook. For those watching on Torah Anytime, where comments aren't available, fill out the form at Techeiles.org/QA during the event. I added that into the slide here. Techeiles.org/QA. For the sake of time and efficiency, I will choose a few questions across these channels to present to each speaker. Lastly, I want to thank each speaker for taking time out of his respective schedule to prepare for this event on this most important topic. Okay. Just screen share audio. Okay.
Years ago, when I lived in Efrat, I found that my neighbor, Baruch Sherman, was producing Techeiles. I was so excited. We will have the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah d'oraisa. As the years went by, more and more people came to see the truth. Not only those who wear Techeiles, but also those who participate in popularizing Techeiles among Klal Yisrael. I envy Baruch and his co-workers who have the great challenge of restoring this precious mitzvah to Klal Yisrael. May Hashem bless them and bless all their efforts with success.
The beautiful mitzvah of Techeiles was loved and revered by the Jews, but this was not enough to overcome the travails of history, and some 1,300 years ago the knowledge of its preparation, and even the identification of the sea snail, the chilazon, source of the dye, slipped into obscurity. As the focus of Jewish life moved farther away from the northern coast of Israel, the center of the ancient Techeiles dyeing industry, many lost hope that the beautiful mitzvah might ever be restored, save by miraculous divine intervention. But not everyone shared this view. In modern times, scholars, both secular and Jewish, began to study the topic, searching for clues that could help shed light on the ancient blue and purple dyes. Most notable of these were Rav Gershon Henoch Leiner of Radzin and Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, chief rabbi of Ireland, who would eventually become the first chief rabbi of the State of Israel. In 1914, Rabbi Herzog completed a doctorate, collecting essentially all knowledge that was currently available on Techeiles. As archaeological and historical evidence began to mount, pointing towards the Murex trunculus sea snail as the chilazon, the great modern mystery surrounding the attempt at rediscovering Techeiles began to take shape. There were three statements that people believed to be true. 1. The Murex trunculus is the chilazon, the source of the Techeiles dye. 2. Murex snails produced a beautiful purple dye. 3. Techeiles is blue. Those three statements cannot all be true. Secular scholars maintain that the third statement was false, namely that Jewish tradition was mistaken and Techeiles must have been purple. The Radziner Rebbe railed against that opinion and warns his students not to, quote, fall into the trap set by the non-Jewish scholars who care not for the Jewish tradition and whose research and knowledge have led them to believe that its color, Techeiles' color, is purple. And so he rejected the first statement and searched for an alternative candidate for the chilazon other than a sea snail. Rav Herzog did not accept the Radziner's approach and remained confused. On the one hand, he found the evidence from archaeology convincing. That the murex was used for dyeing in the ancient world was an incontrovertible fact. He also respected the scientists who were telling him that the murex could only dye purple. But he was simply not willing to dismiss the deeply held Jewish tradition so emphatically stated in both Midrash as well as Halacha that Techeiles was sky blue. Even though the topic was dear to him throughout his life, Rav Herzog died in 1959 with a mystery still in place. The chilazon was most probably the murex, but murex snails give a purple dye, and Techeiles is blue. Before we can attempt to solve this mystery, we need to look at how exactly one dyes with the snail altogether. The first stage in the dyeing process is to extract the glands that store the dye from the Murex trunculus sea snail by breaking open the shells and extracting the glands one by one. Then we dry them and grind them into a powder. Next we add hot water. You can see that even after stirring the mixture, the powdered glands sink to the bottom and the water stays completely clear, because the dye molecules are not water-soluble. This is what we should expect from a good fast dye, since we don't want the color to wash out. But it poses a major problem, since if the dye won't bond to water, how can we attach it to the wool fibers? We need to trick it chemically, first to get it to dissolve in water, then embed it in the wool, and finally return it to its inert state so it will never wash out. We do this by adding a very strong base, caustic soda. This has two effects. It helps dissolve some of the fats and proteins that are unwanted byproducts we get from the snail. The second and main purpose is to set the pH so that the next chemical can work. This chemical is the most important one, sodium dithionite. It's a very strong reducing agent and allows the dye to bond with water. As you can see, the color of the vat mixture now changes. It's not the blue Techeiles that we want, but at least we can see that something is dissolving in the water. Before we can add the wool, we need to neutralize the solution a bit by adding a mild acid. Citric acid will do, so as not to damage the wool. Adding this chemical generates an overpowering odor. No wonder it was forbidden to dye in Yerushalayim because of the smell. But as it happens, if it weren't for the incredibly horrible smell, we might never have discovered the secret of Techeiles in modern times. We're now ready to add the wool, and from this stage moving forward, every act has to be done with the proper kavanah, with the express purpose of fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit. And so we will now say, L'shem mitzvah tzitzit. We will now leave the dye in the sun for reasons that will become apparent shortly and return to the mystery of Techeiles that we spoke of earlier. The solution to the problem of Murex dyes producing only purple was solved in 1985 when a crucial piece of information became available. Professor Otto Elsner, an Israeli chemist at the Shenkar College of Fibers, who had been a dye chemist in Poland before the war, began to research the Murex snails and their dyes. Since the dye process results in an overwhelming stench, as we mentioned, and something that the Talmud already notes, Elsner took his work outside to the fresh air. He followed the standard process, broke open the snails, took out the dye glands, and put them in a vat with the chemicals needed to get them to dissolve in water in order to dye wool. When he removed the wool, it turned purple, just like everyone before him. But that was only on cloudy days. When he did the dyeing in bright sunlight, the color of the wool was a beautiful sky blue. Elsner had discovered that exposing the dye to sunlight at a very specific point in the dyeing process changes the purple components into blue. Let's take a look more closely at the chemistry behind Elsner's discovery. There are three molecules that the Murex snail produces. The first is indigo, which has a blue color. There are also two more molecules, an indigo base with one or two bromine atoms attached. Those are called monobromoindigo and dibromoindigo, and they have purple colors. If you dye wool in a mixture of all three of these molecules, and that's the way the secretion comes out of the snail, you get purple. In order to get any of these molecules to become soluble in water, that is, in order to enable them to dye wool, they need to undergo a process called reduction. The chemicals that were added to the solution were meant to do exactly that. In the reduced states, the molecules change color to yellow-green. Elsner found that during this phase, exposing the molecules that had bromine attached, mono or dibromoindigo, to the radiation of sunlight breaks the bonds between the indigo base and its attached bromine atoms. What is left is indigo, or almost indigo. The molecule still is in its reduced state, and in order to fix it strongly to the wool so that it will never wash out, it needs to be taken out of reduction, a process called oxidation. At that point, it returns to its proper color, not purple, but the beautiful blue of Techeiles, similar to the sea and similar to the sky. The effects of sunlight would most certainly have been noticed by the ancient dyers, since they did all their work on the shores of the sea under the bright Mediterranean sun. At this point, we are ready to take the wool out of the dye solution and expose it to the air where it will undergo oxidation. The transformation of the dye mixture due to sunlight has already taken place. As you can see, the wool slowly changes color to the beautiful sky blue that our tradition had always maintained. The color of Techeiles dyed wool is, as the Rambam states, the color of the clear sky as it appears to the eye. Murex dyes are also among the most color-fast natural dyes known. Again, as the Rambam states, it remains steadfast in its beauty and will never change. With the rediscovery of Techeiles, of its source, the chilazon, and of the process required to dye wool, perhaps we can paraphrase the Midrash and be grateful to Hashem that now we no longer have only white, for Techeiles has been found.
All right. So To kickstart the event, our first speaker, Dr. Yisrael Irving Zeideman, has been involved with Techeiles research for over 5 decades. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Animal
I see you
Physiology
in the background. You're there.
from
Please
London
move over here. Oh, they're doing.
London University, as well as a Master of Science and PhD degrees in biochemistry from the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. When the editors of the Talmudic Encyclopedia approached Dr. Zeideman in 1969 to summarize the doctoral thesis on Techeiles written in 1913 by Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog, former chief rabbi of Israel, it was his first exposure to the topic. Over the years since then, he has become a worldwide authority on Techeiles. He authored the scientific proof for the identification of the banded dye murex as a snail used to produce the ancient Techeiles, and also studied Talmudic sources on the Techeiles in order to substantiate his scientific results.
I see you in the picture.
Again, please ask questions so that they can be addressed to the event by typing it into the comments section under the different channels. If you're watching it through, let's say, TorahAnytime.com, there's a link, techeiles.org/QA. You can type in the questions in the contact form over there, and they will be addressed as well after each speaker. Okay, so I'm just gonna mute myself.
Shalom from Shoresh, Israel. Welcome to this wonderful event. I'd like to open my remarks with a quotation from Maimonides. The Rambam deals with the question, what is the relationship between scientific discovery and halakha? And this he writes about at the end of the laws of Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctification of the new moon. And these are his words in translation to English. The rationale for all these calculations, which the Rambam has gone through and explained in 16 chapters of this section, the rationale for all these calculations and the reasons why this number is added and why that subtraction is made, and how all these concepts are known, and the proofs for each of these principles are the subject of the sciences of astronomy and geometry, concerning which the Greeks wrote many books. These texts are presently in the hands of the sages, but the texts that means the sages in his time, but the texts written by the sages of Israel in the age of the prophets from the tribe of Yisachar have not been transmitted to us. So all we had, the Maimonides had in his time, and so today, all we have are the scientific works of the Greeks. Nevertheless, since these concepts can be proven in an unshakable manner, leaving no room for question, the identity of the author, be he a prophet or a Gentile, is of no concern. For a matter whose rationale has been revealed and has proven truthful in an unshakable manner, we do not rely on the personal authority of the individual who made these statements or taught these concepts, but solely on the proofs he presented and the reasons he made known. This shows us how important a scientific discovery is when we're discussing this matter. Another idea I'd like to present to you before I start talking specifically about the Techeiles is a critical reading of the sources we have. Those sources which were written down and composed before the time when Techeiles disappeared in the 7th century of the Common Era, and those, of course, written afterwards right until our day. What I would like to say is that those written before Techeiles disappeared, we expect the author to have seen himself Techeiles and seen the Chilazon, and he could have a first-hand knowledge of the subject. But those written since then, since the 7th century, there are only really descriptions of how the author learned and studied the subject, written by others before his time. And this is really a question of aid and aid, and therefore we must be critical about anything written at the time when the author would himself not have seen the Chilazon and not have seen the Techeiles. I'd like to divide my talk into three parts. The first one is on the identification of the chilazon. Second of all, the color of the tchelet. And thirdly, what is the current research, scientific research that's being carried out today. First of all, the identification of the chilazon. It's important for us to distinguish tchelet from the other dyed wools that are mentioned in the Bible, argaman and tolat shani. First of all, let me show you the creature called kermes, which is a scale insect that lives on oak trees. And if you look carefully, I'll try and focus here. Yes, you can see in the glass there are little balls, small red black balls which are rolling around, and that is the kermes from which the tolat shani color was made. You can see them very clearly now. They live and grow on oak trees in Israel and other countries, and from them the tolat shani was made, and the color of that dye is a shade of red called crimson. The second one is the argaman in English Tyrian purple, and that is purely one chemical called dibromo indigo, which you saw in the video. And this is made from many species of marine mollusks, shellfish, in many parts of the world, in different seas around the world. Let me just show you what the chilazon of the argaman looks like. I think you can see that. Yes, there. Let me rotate it a bit so you can see the other side. This is the shellfish from which argaman is made, Tyrian purple. And finally, we come to the chilazon from which tchelet is made. This is the banded dimurex, or Murex trunculus. Here she is. And you can see one side is the other side. This is called in English a banded dimurex. This shellfish lives purely in the Mediterranean Sea and the adjacent Atlantic coasts. Now, how do we understand the words of Maimonides, of Rambam, when he writes regarding the chilazon at Tchelet, B'yam hamelach hu matzui. The chilazon is found in the Salt Sea. He is not talking about the Dead Sea, which we are familiar with today, which we call Yam HaMelech in modern Hebrew, but he is talking about the Mediterranean. And he is saying that only in the Mediterranean in the salt water, can this chilazon live and be caught. The interesting thing is that the words B'yam HaMelech hu matzui, he is found in the Salt Sea, is actually the way the Rambam understood the words of the Gemara on the same issue, but there it says, Oleh achat l'shivim shana. The chilazon comes up once in 70 years. And this has been regarded just as an exaggeration, but really the Maimonides solves the problem of coming up once in 70 years, which can't be describing some real creature. What he's saying is the chilazon comes up once in 70 years. In other words, it never comes up. If you wait 70 years, you may see it. What he's saying is that it's all the time, it's in the sea, it never comes up. And therefore, this chilazon which we have, which I just showed you, was in the video. This chilazon is only found in the Mediterranean Sea. The second problem with the words of our sources is the words of the Gemara regarding the chilazon, but gufo dome layam. Its body is similar to the sea. This is usually given to understand the color of its body, and the color of the shell is similar to that of the sea. But I've just showed you, and you saw before in the video, that this shellfish is its shell the color of the sea. To me, it looks just off-white, a little cream color, and that's it. So how could this ever be called having a body color similar to that of the sea? The fact of the matter is that this shellfish and the ones we saw before have been cleaned from biological fouling, all kinds of creatures which in their natural state live and multiply on the shell. And I have here an example of this. You can see in this shell fish, which actually is one of those from which we make argaman, you can see that the shellfish on the shell on the outside is covered with beautiful colors, which are similar to the biological fouling which you find on the stones and on the rocks on the seabed all around Israel. And therefore, it's difficult for the divers who are collecting the chilazonot to distinguish between the actual shellfish and the stones and rocks around it. And that is the meaning of gufot domeh layam. It is similar to the sea. And you may say to me, just a minute, the sea is water. What color is water? Haha, that is not the meaning of sea in this case, because we have in the temple we had a structure called Yam Shel Shlomo, the basin of Shlomo, which was used for washing. That Yam means a basin of Solomon, and therefore Gufot Domeh Layam, its body, its shell, is similar in color to the sea bed. So we have now described something about the identification of the chilazon, and the word for this color we call purple. The color of the argaman is actually taken from the Greek word porphyra, and porphyra refers in Greek to mollusks that yield the dyes. And from those that yield dyes, the ancients divided into two separate categories. One of Techeles and another one was argaman. And in English, that is hyacinth purple, that's Techeles, and Tyrian purple, which is the color of the argaman. Hyacinth purple is the Techeles, and Tyrian purple is the argaman. The interesting thing about the Techeles is this was one of the most important industries and most lucrative industries in antiquity, and it had no unique connection with Jewish tradition or biblical requirements at all. And this we know from all the ancient literature, the archaeological finds, and comparing languages. But even in our own book of Yechezkel, the prophet Yechezkel, in chapter 27, he describes how Techeles and argaman were part of international traveling and wasn't something specifically Jewish. And there it says, I'll say it in English, Haran and Caneh and Eden, the traffickers of Sheba, Assyria, and Media were your traffickers. They were your traffickers with adornments, with wraps of Techeles, international trade. And the previous verse says there, linen with embroidery from Egypt was your sail, the sail of your Israeli boats, to be to you for a staff. Techeles and argaman from the isles of Elisha was your covering. And so we see that all the information from the ancient world regarding this industry of Techeles was common to them, to the world, and to Israel. And therefore, from that, we can learn all these details, specific details about our Techeles, which we're interested in. Let me now go to the second question, the color of Techeles. This has always been a big issue and a thing of great interest. In order to understand this subject, it's important to understand, in order to know that in the ancient world, there was no abstract concept of color. In our case, Techeles and argaman were not colors at all, but they are commodities dyed with wool. Wool dyed to certain colors, in this case with chilazonot, with shellfish, and in the case of tolat shani, with the Kermes insect. So you may say to me, how do I know that these are not the names for colors? Well, that's simple. We know that these materials are mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Shemot, and there is part of a verse which lists those materials which were used in building the Mishkan. And there it says, Zahav, v'chesef, v'nechoshet, tchelet, argaman, v'tolat, shani, v'shesh. Now here the verse starts off with the gold, the zahav, and then the silver, and then the copper, the nechoshet. Are these referring just to the color of gold, the color of silver? Of course not. Everyone knows and realizes also from the continued use of the word that gold is referring to the metal gold. Similarly, silver metal, and similarly to the copper, the nechoshet, and similarly the rest of the verse continues. Tchelet, argaman, tolat, shani. They are dyed wools. They are commodities and not just abstract colors. So we've reached a point where we see that in antiquity, but what is called in our Bible Techeiles was understood in the language of the time mainly as hyacinth purple, and this gives us, I think, the most important pointer to what color we are talking about, because the hyacinth purple and the wild hyacinth. The wild hyacinth is a flower which everyone should be able to see. And if you don't have one where you live, you can catch it, find it in the internet, and you can see what a beautiful, radiant blue this flower has. But however, in the shellfish which we're talking about, with the chilazon of the Techeiles, there is no color at all. Only in a certain gland of the chilazon, there is a colorless precursor, which is removed, as we saw in the video, and taken through two stages. The first one is formation of the dye stuff, which you didn't see so clearly in the video, followed by the second stage of dyeing. Now, what about the formation of a dye from the colorless precursors, which are actually extracted into hot water from the body of the snails? First of all, no illumination, no sunlight is required for this first stage to form the Techeiles dye stuff. But if you, instead of taking many dye fish, as you saw in the video, many chelazonot, not if you take many of them and you gather them together, as you saw in the video, you'll notice that the color that you get is the color of violet, as you saw in the video. But if you take individual shellfish one at a time and take the small amount of color from each one, then the color varies. Some of them give blue, and some of them give shades of purple. And this is a subject which is not still understood and has not been researched. Finally, attempts have been made to understand what's different between one chilazon and the other. Some of them give blue, and some of them give purple. Of course, this is due to different proportions of between the amounts of the three constituents of the violet monobromo indigo, which you saw in the video, the purple dibromo indigo, and the blue indigotine. But why there should be difference between one snail and another is still not known, and this is a real challenge for us. So what we receive from the shellfish, as you saw in the video, is a color which is violet, and violet appears to be inappropriate, because we expect, as the video showed, we expect to have a blue color. So the process was use of a photochemical breakdown, which was applied during stage 2 of the dyeing, and that decomposes, as you saw in the video, the two bromo indigos, converting all the color stuff to blue indigo itself, as you saw in the video. But this process, which you saw quite clearly demonstrated in the video, raises certain issues. The first one is in antiquity there was no illumination during the dyeing process. They didn't conduct the dyeing in glass vessels, as you saw in the video, but in clay or rock vessels, and these vessels were covered during the time that the dye was developed. So the debromination, which you saw in the video, couldn't have been carried out in antiquity. Second of all, as you saw, and the essential part of the process of debromination, which you saw, is the use of a very strong chemical, dithionite. But this is a modern artificial chemical reagent that did not exist in antiquity. A third issue is that if you would apply this debromination reaction to argaman, to pure bromo indigo, you get all of it converted to indigo. Because of this, all of the shellfish, those of Techeiles and those of argaman, would all give the same blue color, and therefore you would have no chilazon, which was specific for Techeiles. And this obviously is not what we understand from the way it's described in the Talmud in particular, and in the Maimonides, that there was a specific hachilazon, which was used only for making Techeiles. And not only that, but there was also in the Talmud, copied by the Rambam in his halakha, that there was an analytical test performed in antiquity by our ancestors, which could distinguish between Techeiles on the one hand and a forged blue dye called kala ilan, which is considered to be indigo itself. Now, these two materials are the same. The blue formed, the indigo formed from the chilazon that we saw in the video, and the blue indigo which you received from kala ilan. They're the same chemical material, and therefore, in an analytical test as described in the Talmud and in Maimonides, they would be distinguished. But if we have all of the bromo indigo converted into indigo, there would be no difference, and therefore it wouldn't stand up to the analytical test written in the Bible. And finally, I'd like to mention, why bother to go through such an arduous process of fishing and changing all the chemistry in order to produce this indigo when it's readily available as kala ilan. And so therefore there are so many doubts. There's safek, and there's another safek, safeka. And therefore there's a real problem here of how we can really believe that this product, this debromination product, was used in antiquity. So now that's the bad news I'm bringing to you. But of course there is good news going with it, and that's why I'm here, in order to tell you that if we take the violet color, the dye or the dyed wool, as produced directly from the chilazon on mild heating to 60 or 80 degrees, the violet color changes spontaneously to blue in a thermochromic transition, it's called by chemists, and there's no change in molecular structure or molecular composition that you saw demonstrated to you by the formulae in the video. This process of just heating is non-destructive, as I said. No chemical change, is irreversible. And so why does it happen? Well, how can the color change without any chemical change? This has been researched by leading chemists in recent year or two, and it's been proved that the change in color is only due to a decrease in the particle size of the dye stuff dyed in the wool or in the pure dye itself. So conversion of initial violet Techeiles to indigo is unnecessary, and it would be good if we could utilize this new knowledge of replacing the debromination process with a thermochromic transition without any change in the material which we're using. I would like now to add one personal note. When I pioneered the renewal of Techeiles and the discovery of the chilazon of the Techeiles, my idea was to produce some new kiyum of a mitzvah that will be able to unite the people of Israel of all walks of life and in all places in one Ptil Techeiles in their tzitzit. But unfortunately, over the soon after this was done, and in particular in the years, the few decades which have followed since then, and we found there are over 30 different ways of tying the tzitzit with tchelet, based on all kinds of sources, ancient sources, which were, as I mentioned before, should be not be taken too seriously, because they were all written after there was no tchelet available anyway, after the 7th century of the Common Era. We have a prohibition of lo titkodedu, not to make all separate ways of fulfilling our mitzvot. But nevertheless, I see that public there are sites on the internet which publish and give you even directions how to tie on over 30 different ways. And this is changing our mitzvot into some kind of supermarket where you wander around and choose what color, what design, and what arrangement takes your fancy, and use that. I think this is something detrimental, and I must really tell you that sometimes I even regret that I started this whole bandwagon of tchelet, because it's led to this division and argumentation over what is the correct way to tie the tzitzit with tchelet. Ongoing research. The very last remark I would like to make. Professor Muki Spiegel of Haifa University, my colleague, last year received a special grant from the Ministry of Agriculture in Israel in order to research tchelet. What is he researching? What is left now to be researched? It is because until today, and it will continue, the chilazon of the tchelet is a protected species in Israel, and we are not allowed to collect or gather or fish the chilazonot of tchelet from the Israeli seaboard. We have to import them from other countries in the northern part of the Mediterranean. And of course, this means we're depending on the chasadim of the goyim to be able to carry out this import, and we can't be sure that it will carry on forever. And therefore, Professor Muki Spiegel is going to try to find a method of growing and breeding the chilazon of tchelet in captivity, in glass containers, so that we can produce, first of all, the chilazon grown from native chilazonot tchelet which live on the Israeli shore and not in Bulgaria or in some other country. Second of all, it will mean we'll be able, in a captivity, to preserve this chilazon for posterity, because there have been periods in the last couple of years in which, in certain places, it was extremely difficult to find the chilazonot tchelet in the sea, and they seem to have disappeared, seem to have been destroyed. Why? Because of pollution, which is a well-known scientific discovery, ecological discovery, that the poisons due to pollution of the Mediterranean can and have at certain stages reduce the populations to below anything that we can use, and therefore we have them in captivity. We'll be able to multiply them whenever we need to. So, and this system, which Professor Spiegel's work on, is called mariculture. That means agriculture in the sea. And by breeding the chilazonot in aquarium, we'll be able to have the amounts to provide chilazon without any limits in the amounts and a price that we can choose. That is all that I wanted to say. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you found my explanations of interest. And of course, question time. And if there's not enough time for all the questions, I'm sure I'll be very pleased if you all would contact me by email, and I would be pleased to share any further knowledge with you. Can't hear him. No, it's turned off. No good. So I finish. I can't hear anything.
Your throat is dry.
I can't hear you.
Drink water, your throat is dry.
So,
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Thank you, Dr. Zeideman. So, in the interest of time, I see that there have been a few questions asked. So I'll select a handful from various forums, and we'll go on to the next speaker. So the first question I see here is from Micha Berger. He asks, If having multiple different ways of tying is lo siskodedu, then wouldn't the same apply for two different orders of parshios and tefillin? And yet, that machlokas existed for centuries until the Rambam, Rashi, and Rabbeinu Tam felt a need to take sides. Is there a problem of lo siskodedu if people aren't arguing about it and each letting others do their own thing?
Yeah. Well, in English you say comparisons are odious. You can't learn from one question of tefillin to some other issue in general or in particular in halakha. We're all aware of the difference of opinion regarding tefillin, but you've got two choices, and there are many people who quite happily use both types of tefillin every day, every morning, and so there's no problem of how to conduct oneself. But here we're talking of an amazing number of over 30 different ways of tying, and in any shul where many people are wearing a patil techelet, you see that every corner there's something different, and I think that is what upsets me.
Okay. Next question is from Ed Malkiel. He asks, we understand from your work that the purple color may change to blue long after the dyeing process when exposed to heat or sunlight. How then can we be sure that the original color of archaeological textile artifacts was blue?
Was what?
Sorry.
Local?
We understand from your work that the purple color may change to blue long after the dyeing process when exposed to heat or sunlight. How then can we be sure that the original color of the archaeological textile artifacts was blue? It may have turned to blue now, right? But how do we know that originally it was blue and not purple?
Well, that's a very good question, and I didn't want to go into that aspect. Of course, according to our sources, Talmudic and Midrashic and all the ancient literature that we have, we don't know. Nowhere does it say what color it's supposed to be. In fact, even as mentioned by all writers on this subject, in particular in the video, and there it says they quote the saying in the Talmud and in the Midrash that Techelet domeh layam. The Techelet is similar color to the sea and similar to the sky. But this is just one version. As the Rabbi Herzog brought in his doctorate, there are 8 different versions of this Agadah. And in the Yalkut Shimoni, it says, for instance, I'm quoting, Techelet domeh la'asabim. That's the first thing it's similar to. Techelet is similar to plants. Asabim, and it continues, Asabim domim la'ilanot. The Asabim themselves, they're similar in color to trees. And then and after that only ilanot larakia, trees are similar to the color of the sky, and it even goes on rakia lanoga. The sky is similar to one of the planets, Noga, which is white, and Nogala Keshet, which is all the others. And also Midrash Rabbah, you find the same. You say the same Techelet domeh la'asabim. So you don't really know what color it was. My guiding principle has been that what the halakha lays down in the Talmud is that haba min hachilazon, Techelet haba min hachilazon, made from the chilazon, is kshera. But that saying continues, and it says sheba lo min hachilazon pesula. There's a double law here. It tells you the positive law, and also it tells you the opposite is not kasher. And this means that the color which you obtain from the chilazon itself is the color that you're supposed to get. And as the questioner asked, of course you instantly don't get a purple, you get a violet color, which is bluer than purple. And let me just show you what I'm talking about. Here I've got a picture. I hope. Let me just get it focused here. Yes, you can see here the on the right you can see purple, which is dibramo indigo. That's argaman. And then the next one in the middle is the monobromo indigo, which you can see is a beautiful violet color. and that when you heat it, it goes blue. That's MBI, heated. And finally, on the left, you have regular plant indigo, color Ilan, and you should be able to see that the indigo and the indigo here on the side, and the that's here, and the heated monobromo indigo next to it are the same blue color. And therefore, those who would like to use a violet tint in their tchelet, that's certainly very kosher. And those who prefer a blue can do so just by heating it, without any change in the material, the actual material that the dye stuff consists of.
Okay. Dr. Zeideman, you are now on. Are you still on? I think you may have muted yourself.
Pardon?
No, never mind. I thought you accidentally muted yourself. Okay, very good. I think it's a bit over, but there is actually one more question, which Josh Fogel asked based on the previous questions. That's why I'm bringing it up, and then we'll move to the next speaker. Can heating other species besides the murex, so the Hexaflex trunculus more particularly, can any other species be heated up to turn violet to indigo, quote unquote, blue? If yes, how can we say that only the murex trunculus or the Hexaflex trunculus is the true color source of Techeiles?
Oh, good. That's a very important question, and there's no problem in this case. This specific thermochromic transition is a very, very rare chemical event. It only occurs in very, very few types of dye molecules, and in fact, I don't even know any other ones personally. The reaction which I'm talking about only occurs with one chemical dye, monobromo indigo. Monobromo indigo. That is the one that changes from violet to blue, as the questioner asked. And this material, monobromo indigo, is only found in the chilazon tchelet. And so far, there's no problem that the questioner refers to. This change of color is specific to our chilazon. There is another reaction which is similar in this connection, in which if you heat, a scientist has found, although there hasn't been research in Israel at all, another scientist found that if you heat dibromo indigo, it can become redder. Instead of going towards blue, it goes red, but that's a separate reaction, and that's nothing to do with a tchelet. It only would apply to a discussion on Argaman, but that will probably be the subject of our next Yom Iyun.
Bezras Hashem. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zeideman, for giving your time and insight. I'm seeing from the comments that everybody has really appreciated not only the 50 plus years of research that you've done, but also the few minutes that you've been able to present your latest findings and also answer a few very important questions. So I'm going to move on to the next speaker now. Okay, so just 1 second. Just gonna add this to stream. Yes, so Rabbi Chaim Twersky is a Rosh Yeshiva and head of the Smicha program at Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois. He is a scion of the Chernobyl Hasidic family. Before arriving at HTC, he studied under Rabbis Elliot Svei and Rabbi Shmuel Kamenetsky at the Talmudical Yeshiva of Philadelphia. Later, he studied in Beis Medrash Gavaya in Lakewood and served as a founding member of the Kollel Los Angeles, where he gained a reputation for his mastery of halacha and Jewish philosophy. He is a noted scholar and writer on a number of topics that relate to Jewish law. He also serves as senior rabbi of Beis Chaim David in Lincolnwood, Illinois. So I'm going to switch the podium over to Rabbi Twersky.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to discuss a side topic on the issues related to Techeiles. I'm going to make the assumption that we have the Techeiles, that the Techeiles that we have today is the true Techeiles. Or if you don't like that assumption, I'm going to relate this back to once upon a time when there was the complete Techeiles, and asked the following question. Someone that asked me, he said to me, I know for sure that the Techeiles that you have is the right color, it's the right Techeiles, but I still don't think I can wear it. And I asked him why. He said, because I'm stuck. There's a machlokes, Rishonim, and it hasn't been concluded yet as to who's correct about the number of strings. The Rambam and Raavad say it's one. Rambam actually, according to some, saying it's half a string or one string. And then there's the Rashi and Tosas who say it's two strings. Now, I'm stuck because I'm afraid of being over about Tosef, about Tigra. Supposing the halacha is you're supposed to have one string and I'm going to put down two strings, then about Tosef. If the halacha is supposed to be two strings and I'm going to put one string, then I'll be over about Tigra. I don't want to get involved in a machlokes without knowing, and I don't want to be over a lot. So the best thing to do is not to get involved. My immediate question to him is, hold on a minute. If you're worried about Tigra about one string, shouldn't you be worried about Tigra with no strings? So I went to study this subject a bit, and I found that at least the question that he asked seems to be similar to a machlokes that we'll find in Zvachim, Daf Pei, a Mishnah, about a mixture of karbonos. There's some karbonos that have only one matana and one application of Dam on the Mizbeach, that's, let's say, a Bchor, and another one that has to have four, let's say, an Ola, that's Shnaim Shem Arba. And they got mixed up. So the question was what to do. There was a machlokes Rebbe Eliezer and Rebbe Shua. Rebbe Eliezer said, you should take the mixture and put all four on. Put on all four sides, be mat and talit. So, and Rebbe Shua said, no, only do one. So he said to Rebbe Shua, you're going to be over about Tosef, because the one that's supposed to be only one application, you're giving four. So he turned around to him and he said, well, no, then you're being over about Tigra. So he said, no, about Tosef I don't have here, because that's only if it's alone. In other words, about Tosef, if I have a Bchor dam and I put it on four sides, then I'll be over about Tosef. But it is. But here it's a mixture. So he said, well, the same thing about Tigra. It's the same thing. It's only if it's a mixture. Besides which, according to you, the way you're doing it, you're being over Kum V'aseh, and I'm being over about Tigra b'Shev al Taisa. I'd rather do b'Shev al Taisa. So this seems to be somewhat similar to our dilemma, because either I'll be over about Tosef, I'll be over about Tigra, and I don't want to do either. Yet no one suggested that each person over there should just drop the blood and throw it on the floor and not be over about Tosef and about Tigra. It's supposed to do something. In truth, however, I think we don't have a good comparison to that Mishnah, even though it looks very similar. For the following reason. The Yisur Bal Tosef doesn't apply only in the case of tzitzis or tefillin, or as I mentioned, sifrei, or lulav and esrog, where you add an extra, take one up, you add one more, make 5 minim or 3 minim. It also applies to Haisafa and Zman. It tells us that if a person, Hayashin b'Shmini, if a person sleeps in the sukkah in Shmini, Seres, he's over about Tosef. Because Sukkot is 7 days, and if you do it on the 8th day, you're extending Sukkot to a 9th day, and that's also about Tosef. So the question must be asked, what did they do in Bavel before the Takana was made? And it was a suffix. They didn't know which day Sukkot began. So the Gemara tells what they did. They used to sit in the Sukkah. So the question is, why did they sit in the Sukkah? There's a question about Tosef here. If you don't sit in the Sukkah, you won't be ever about Tosef. So the answer is obvious, and that's a friend give the teretz, and that there's no about Tosef here. I'm doing it to be Mekayim the mitzvah. Maybe I am being Mekayim the mitzvah. As long as I'm doing it to be Mekayim a mitzvah, and it's a suffix, maybe I am, there's no about Tosef. That's not similar to the case over there where you have dam, or if definitely I'm taking blood of chor, which I have, and I'm applying it on all four sides. There, I'm taking a hoisafa on the mitzvah of chor. But here, I might be doing the right thing. Maybe today is Sukkot. So when there's a suffix and the possibility that I'm being mekayim the mitzvah, there's no Baal Tosef. There's no suffix about Tosef. It's that you're allowed to do. So that takes care of the issue of Baal Tosef. However, what about, that's if I'm trying to be mekayim the mitzvah. What about the possibility that if I'm not going to do it at all? Is there a problem about Tigra? So, and this we want to go to Turei Even. The Turei Even brings down from the Rashba. The Turei Even, you'll find it's in Rosh Hashanah Daf Tav Zayin. The Rashba says that he asked the question, how can the Chazal tell us not to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Why isn't that Baal Tigra? So he answers, that's the Yesh Korech B'Yach Chachamim Laku Davar Torah V'Sheva Altzeh. The Torah has the right to do it if it's Mishum Siyag. In other words, based on the concept of trying to make a Siyag, so to make sure that people want to be whatever on Shabbos, they're allowed to Mivatal and Mitzvah Saseh, and that's not considered Baal Tigra. So the Turei Even implies, okay, so what happens if it's not for a Siyag? What are they telling us to do or not to do? There's a mitzvah shofar, and they're telling us don't sound the shofar. So the most that is a bittul and a mitzvah saseh. A bittul mitzvah saseh is a question of Baal Tigra. The Raj was asking why there's no Baal Tigra. So a bittul mitzvah saseh is not Baal Tigra, is it? Every time a person doesn't fulfill a mitzvah, he doesn't wake up in the morning early enough to say Krishma, so he's over Baal Tigra. Or if he skips Krishma Shalarvis, or if any mitzvah, if he skips, is he ever Baal Tigra? That's the Turei Even asked that, and he says that I'll bring a raya sort of that it's not possible to say that that's Baal Tigra. He said not everyone holds that a mitzvah losa say shem ma'isa not in like in the love. So machlokas tanoim. Supposing we hold mitzvah say that's a mitzvah losa say shem ma'isa is like in the love. So then it comes out that anytime a person mevatel a mitzvah say he was ever Baal Tigra, it's a high malchus. We never heard of such a thing. So he believes as a kasha. Achronim answer this question, and the Vilna Gaon says more or less the same thing, that there are two mitzvahs in a sense. There are two types of Tosef and Baal Tigra. Actually, there are two psukim. There's one in Ve'aschanan, and there's another one in Re'eh. And one says Lois Sigra v'Lois Soisif and Lois Sigru v'Lois Sosifu. One is in plural and one is singular. So one is a halacha with regard to Beis Din. Beis Din is not allowed to take away a mitzvah, and Beis Din means Beis HaGodel, can't make a mitzvah, can add a mitzvah. There's limitations to what Beis Din is allowed to do in interpreting the Torah. They can't say, for example, today, up to now, we needed to keep tefillin, we're dropping mitzvah tefillin, or whatever mitzvah you want to drop. That's loy sigra. Don't say that the mitzvah of, the mitzvah of kashrus, we don't need kashrus anymore. It's just like the Reform rabbis used to say, we don't need it anymore. Don't add any mitzvah, don't detract. Even mitzvah of Purim, the Gemara says, Megillah says that it was kosher me'od, it was very difficult. They found it difficult to add a mitzvah of Purim because it's about Tosef, Ad Shematza, a Mikram and a Pasuk, until they found a Makor and the Psuk in the Torah. So that's halacha on Beis Din. And then there's another halacha about Tosef, about Tigra. That's in the formation of the mitzvah itself and the way you fulfill the mitzvah. That we have examples, and the Sifrei brings examples in adding on to the mitzvah. Don't put 5 parshas in your tefillin. Don't put 3 parshas in the tefillin. Don't put tzitzis on 5 corners. Don't put it on 3 corners. These are the examples. Don't take an extra min. Don't take a rosa together with the hadassim or rovas and put it together. This goes into the shalos of what's called together. But al kapanim, the concept is there that you're not supposed to add to the mitzvah or detract from the mitzvah. So now we have to ask the question. Okay, so that answers our question about the other person doesn't do a mitzvah at all. That's a bittul mitzvah, I say. A person does the mitzvah, but he does it in a manner that's less or more than the way the formation of that mitzvah is concerned. That's Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra. So if a person doesn't wear tzitzis, even if he has a garment, doesn't wear tzitzis, it's not over Baal Tigra. If he wears and he puts on 3 tzitzis, he is over Baal Tigra. So the question we ask, what about if a person fulfills the mitzvah without the mitzvah of Techeiles? Is that Baal Tigra? Is that like not doing the mitzvah, so like it's bittul, and that's nothing more than bittul mitzvahs, or it's worse than that, that's Baal Tigra? There's a base Halevi who says, in fact, that is Baal Tigra. You're over Baal Tigra if you don't wear Techeiles in your garment. So he asks a kasha, so then how are we Mekayim the mitzvah? We don't have Techeiles. So he says, I'll say is the Techeiles. Gemara says that you're Mekayim the mitzvah without it. So if you're Mekayim the mitzvah without it, it's Ein Ma'akev, we pass on it's not Ma'akev, so you're Mekayim the mitzvah. So you take over Baal Tigra, but the mitzvah say is the Techeiles. If you follow that along, then if that's true, I say is the Techeiles, it's Yef Shel L'Kaim Shneim. But if you have Techeiles, then it's Efshel L'Kaim Shneim. And if it's Efshel L'Kaim Shneim, then you're ever Baal Tigra if you don't wear Techeiles with your tzitzis. That's the way he would hold. However, I don't think that I have a problem with that. And first I use a logical problem, and then I come out a little bit further. The logical problem is that we find that says the Techeiles when the law says is general. It's not specific, integral to this thing. For example, shatnez and tzitzis. Shatnez applies to everything. A jacket, a coat, a blanket. It's a shatnez. It happens to come in combination to the mitzvah of tzitzis when you wear Techeiles. Techeiles has to be made of wool, and you have a linen garment. So then these two come in conflict. So then the asay is the chalas asay. But if the los asay is the mitzvah itself, if the Torah is saying los asay means I do not want you to be mekayim the mitzvah in a deficient manner, then you can't say an asay is the chalas asay because the Torah says not to do that. That's the logical problem with that. But there's something greater than that. That is, I think, evidence that there is no Baal Tosef, Baal Tigra altogether. And that's from the following. There's a machlokas really, but the Shulchan Aruch paskins, if you put 5 strings in your tzitzis rather than 4, that's Baal Tosef. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, it's in Hilchot Tzitzis, Minyan Chuti HaTzitzis B'Kol Kanaf Arba Kfulim. The number of strings you put in is 4 doubled over, Shem Shmona, which comes 8. V'im Hoisif Pasul. And if you added the 5th one, it's Pasul. Mishabura says, Mishum Dekaver Baal Tosef. Adding an addition one, you're over Baal Tosef. So if you're over Baal Tosef, you're not becoming the mitzvah at all. Beginning of Perek Techeiles, it says Techeiles in Makvas 11 in Makvas Techeiles. So Rashi says there that if you wear 4 strings of white, you're still mekayim. It's not ma'akev that you weren't wearing Techeiles. And if you have 4 strings of Techeiles, it's ma'akev that you're not mekayim. It's not ma'akev and you're mekayim the mitzvah before Techeiles. Now, if you're mekayim the mitzvah before Techeiles, then for sure you're mekayim with 3 or 2. There's no, even if it's clear that whether the mitzvah is 2 or 1, if you're doing 4, that's an addition. And it says you're mekayim. So it's impossible to say that, according to Rashi, that you're over Baal Tosef with an additional Techeiles string, if all 4 of them is that way. The Rambam, even though he doesn't learn the sugya of Techeiles and Makvas 11 exactly like Rashi, but he still says the same thing with regard to the din of fulfillment of the mitzvah of tzitzis. He said in Ma'akev, it's not 2 separate mitzvahs, ala mitzvah achas. And if you wear tzitzis with lavan, or Techeiles, or not lavan Techeiles, or shneim kachad, or both of them, Harei kayem mitzvah tzaseh achas. He fulfills one mitzvah. So it's clear the Rambam also agrees to what Rashi says. All white, you're mekayim the mitzvah. All blue, you're mekayim the mitzvah. Some white, some blue, you're mekayim the mitzvah. If the Isser is Baal Toisif and Baal Tigra, and the number of strings that are blue or white, then that's not true. And even if it would be true, the Rambam, and say that you were ever Baal Toisif, you would have at least informed us of that important point. So it's very clear that you're not over Baal Toisif and Baal Tigra with additional white and additional blue. It doesn't matter. Now the question is, why is that so? So the Pashut reason for that is because that's not integral to the mitzvah. That seems to be what the Rambam is saying. If it's not integral to the mitzvah, now the mitzvah is not ma'akev which one the colors they are, as long as you have 4 strings, whether they're white or blue or in between, you're mekayim the mitzvah, so there's no Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra. So that should solve our problem, that even if you don't have Techeiles, you're not over Baal Tigra, you're not Baal Tigra, and even if you have no white, you're also not over Baal Tigra, and whether you have 4 whites or 4 blue, you're not over Baal Tosef. The Isurim are out, you're mekayim the mitzvah. Now I'll add one more point. What about the mitzvah of Techeiles though? Are you mekayim the mitzvah of Techeiles? We still have to be concerned ourselves. Are you fulfilling the mitzvah of Techeiles? Let's say the halachas like Rashi and Tosas, you have 2 and you only do 1. So would you not over Baal Tigra, but and you were mekayim the mitzvah of Tzitzis, but are you perhaps not mekayim the mitzvah of Techeiles? And the reverse, supposing you're supposed to have 1 and you have 2, maybe you're not mekayim the mitzvah of Lavan properly because the mitzvah of Lavan is missing 1. So I'll take it on both ends. Let's assume we hold like Rashi and Tosas that you need 2. My question then, and if supposing you have only 1, are you mekayim the mitzvah of Techeiles? Just not the best way of doing it, but are you still mekayim the mitzvah of Techeiles? So I believe the answer is yes, on the basis of the following. The Torah says that you should bring a seal. Seal is singular, 1 thread. Now, I'm not going to ask a kasha. The Torah says 1. How do you say 2? And as a steer against Rashi and Tosas from a pasuk in the Chumash, of course, I'm not saying that. But I say the following: that if it's ma'akev and you're not yotze the mitzvah at all, then we're accepting that the word seal is not kipshutai. Whenever the halacha is against the pshutai of the Pashas Hakra, there's a long discussion about it in the Gemara. For example, there's a long discussion in the Gemara about Shavuos being not on Sunday. Malchus Shabbos seems to be the following after the first Shabbos in the week of Pesach, like the Tzedukim said. And the Gemara goes on a long discussion to say it's not so. And the Gemara brings us rayas how it's possible to interpret the pasuk against the pshuta. The pasuk talks about ayin tachas ayin. So there's long discussions in Perek HaChovel to explain why ayin tachas ayin doesn't mean ayin tachas ayin. Or Katsoy says kappa. The Gemara brings rayas to say that Katsoy kappa doesn't mean what it says. So if the Torah didn't mean seal, and the halacha is telling us that you need dafka too, so where's the Gemara to tell us that? The Gemara certainly would have sold that. If halacha is that seal is if you want to be in kind of mitzvah, you need at least, of course, 1 thing. And as the Rashi and Tosha said, but since both are mitzvah, it's mistaber that you should have 2 of one and 2 in the other. So that's the din lechatchila. So the Gemara doesn't have to talk about the din lechatchila. The Gemara has to tell us what's ma'akev. Furthermore, Rashi is one who says that you need 2 and 2, and there's a Rashi in Chumash and Pashas Korach describing Korach's argument against Moshe Rabbeinu and saying kalos that is that's completely Techeiles, does it need tzitzis? And of course Moshe Rabbeinu said yes, so he made fun of it. He said, how could that be? One thread of Techeiles will pater the garment, and now you have a whole garment made of Techeiles, and you're going to need another thread of Techeiles. He's bringing the story without seems to be an argument on this point that one will pater. So to answer seems a contradiction that he brings down this medrash that 1 is enough, and he says you need 2. That 1 is ma'akev if you need to have at least 1, and 2 that's a lechatchila. On the other hand, to say that that if you have one and you add one, is that going to be a big problem that you're not mekayim the mitzvah? I can't prove it, but again, the Rambam, according to some, saying that you only need one half. He doesn't make a big issue in saying be careful, make sure that you don't have the second half of that string, because then you'll lose the mitzvah. It's not mashma at all that adding a mitzvah, adding the Techeiles more than you need is going to be a chasaron in the mitzvah of Techeiles. You'll be some mekayim this Techeiles in the mitzvah of tzitzis, as we've said already. For sure, you're mekayim. So you have Techeiles whether it's one or two. Now the only question is, which is the best way of doing it, the Chetchila. So that's already in the Chetchila. That's more or less similar to all the other questions of exactly how to tie. So, Maisa, the halacha is the one chulya is enough, and everything else that you do is various minhagim. And minhagim we don't have. Some have a mitzvah to wrap your tzuah 7 times, and sometimes count to 6 the halves. There's so many different ways people are mekayim various mitzvahs. That doesn't bother anyone in the kiyum. As long as the kiyum of the mitzvah is there, and the minhagim follow your own minhag. That's certainly going to be a fulfillment of the mitzvah. And the question that was raised by this individual, but let's not do it because we're going to get involved in machlokas bal tosef. So I think that has been laid to rest. You don't have to concern yourself. There's no bal tigra, and there's no bal tosef. I'll take questions if there are any. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Twersky. So yes, there actually is one question which I'll bring up to you. It's so if there's no Baal Tosef or Baal Tegra, why is the yeshiva world so hesitant to possibly be Mekayim?
The yeshiva world is hesitant to take it because Rebbe Yashiv didn't go along with it, and Rebbe Chaim Kanievsky didn't go along with it, and there's a number of people who are opponents. There's Rev Steinbruch who's opposed to it, and there's a number of people. Rev Reisman is opposed to it. So there's machlokas here. So people don't like to get involved in machlokas. That's probably why. It's not because of the Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra issue, unless they didn't hear my shir, and then they're still musukik about it.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Rabbi Twersky.
Welcome.
Okay. So now we're going to go on to the next speaker, Rabbi Yoshua Yankelowitz. So just bear with me for 1 minute. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshua Yankelowitz is a renowned expert in the area of Torah scrolls and combines expertise in all these fields with a wide-ranging knowledge of Jewish history, archaeology, and Jewish ritual law. He is consulted worldwide on the provenance and dating of Torah scrolls, helping congregations, museums, and scribes. So I'm just going to add Rabbi Yankelowitz to the stream here. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and share the presentation that will be accompanying this event.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Get myself off here.
Are we live?
One sec. We are live. The keynote is not showing though.
Rafi, how are you? Okay. I can start. Perhaps give me the outline. Over the years that I've been working on the subject of Techeiles, the last 10 years or so, I've come to realize that the subject is far simpler than it's generally made out to be. People generally assume this is an exceptionally convoluted, complicated sugya, a subject involving many, many sources and disciplines. There's a lot of information that has to be put together for this. I've come to the realization that it's actually quite simple. For the most part, the entire subject can be summed up in pretty much one small point. Basically, we know that Techeiles is meant to come from a chalazon. A chalazon is generally assumed to be a snail. This can be demonstrated quite easily based on various midrashim that are usually quoted, that the chalazon has a shell, also based on Middle Eastern languages such as Arabic, Syriac, and others, in which chalazon still today means snail. So we're looking for a dye from a snail, particularly a blue dye. We know it's possible to forge Techeiles from color Iyun, which is widely translated as indigo. So we're looking for a blue dye made from a snail. This is pretty much a given. This is not really where the main core of the subject lies. The question is mainly which chalazon are we looking for? Is there a particular snail that is one that is used for Techeiles? The argument that's usually given could be summed up pretty simply, that we're looking for a world commodity. We're not looking for something that's unique to Jews. Only Jews are using this Techeiles dye, in which case it would be a lot harder to find it. We're looking for something that is used by the Goyim too. Among other sources, besides many midrashim, there's a Gemara that we learned recently. Many of us, I'm sure, have learned this recently in Daf Yomi, which I think is the best proof that we have at this point. The Gemara talks about finding Techeiles in the street. Amar Abelazar Maitzah Techeiles b'shuk. Somebody finds Techeiles in the street. If he finds pieces of wool, they're puzzle because you have the chashash. Perhaps they're used for a glima, for a cloak. This demonstrates quite clearly that Techeiles wasn't uniquely used only for Jews. So basically, we're looking for a non-Jewish dye, not something particularly unique to Jews, some widely used dye that was snail-based and blue. If we were to find one, we're meant to assume that that's probably the Techeiles of Chazal. It so happens to be, again, this is pretty much the focus of the argument, the Techeiles of the non-Jews is rather the blue snail-based dye of the non-Jews is the Techeiles of the Jews. And if we were to find one, it's probably one and the same. Turns out that there is such a dye, widely mentioned in Greek and Latin sources, such as Pliny the Elder, Aristotle, and others, known as a perfura. Again, basically, to sum up the argument, there's a non-Jewish dye, which is widely known. It's called a perfura, and that's probably the same as the blue dye used by the Jews. This is not really a contemporary chiddush. This is something that goes back quite a while. This is already noted by the Chavas Yair in a sefer Makar Chaim. We have the autograph here. In the bottom corner, sort of a marginal note, the Chavas Yair makes mention, the blood of the chalazon that we dye the Techeiles therewith is not blue, rather purple, and it's made from a fish known as the purpur fish. Obviously referring to this dye that's mentioned in Pliny and the other sources that I mentioned. It's mentioned also in the Shiltei Gibarim. Here we have the close-up of that mentioned from the Chavas Yair. The Shiltei Gibarim, not the one on the Rif, another later source, a sefer about the Beis Hamikdash written in Renaissance Italy. And he writes quite clearly, perfura v'hu chalazon shetzayvim by Techeiles. The perfura is a chalazon that one makes Techeiles from. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, you can go in more detail and greater depth to any of these sources and to substantiate the various arguments. There are more sources that the non-Jewish Techeiles is the same as a Jewish Techeiles. There are more sources that a chalazon is a snail. Each and every one of these points can be dwelt on. What is pretty widely accepted is that the perfura of the non-Jews is a snail known today as a Murex trunculus. Again, there are many proofs for this. Among them, the fact that till today, in contemporary Greece, it's still known as the perfura. The question that arises, which is the main focus of today's share, is it's really a double-edged question. We have a lot of information a lot of literature that we generally call, in general, with the wide term, Kisvei Chazal. This obviously includes Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, various midrashim of various sorts. One would expect that, being that the Profura is so widely known and widely recognized, somewhere there should have slipped from Chazal that the Techeiles is a Profura, it's identical. There are midrashim that mention the two next to each other, but where's the smoking gun? Where's this clear reference? And this has become something of a quest for all the proponents of the Murex Techeiles. This would obviously be the most powerful proof we could possibly find if we were to find a medrash that clearly identifies it. More so if we were to find the Gemara or something like that. The second edge of this question is obviously the flip side. If we haven't found such a source, shouldn't that be seen as something of a kind of a proof? One second, if this is not mentioned anywhere in Chazal, so the omission seemingly would point to the fact that this is not one and the same. We should find it somewhere together. It so happens to be that potentially, perhaps we do have such a source in one of the Rishonim Ashkenaz. The Ravya, one of the early Rishonim Ashkenaz, who widely quotes Yerushalmi as follows. This is in Maseches Brachos. On the Mishnah of Misha Yakir, this is Man Kriyishma, we'll go into this in greater depth later in the shir. It says as far as Misha Yakir, the time Misha Yakir ben Techeiles Salavan, and the Rebbe says between Techeiles and Currency. Again, we're going to go into this in greater depth later. He quotes Yerushalmi, V'garsinim b'Yerushalmi, ben Techeiles the Currency, between Techeiles and Currency is being porphyrin ubein prifinan. Theoretically, we have a clear source where it says lahedya beferish, that the Techeiles and the porphyrin are one and the same. Porphyrin theoretically is a cloth dyed by porphyra. Here we have a Yerushalmi translating the Techeiles as being porphyra. What could be better than that? Obviously, this is not so simple, which is why if you speak to somebody about Techeiles, it's not the first source that comes to mind, and this is not brought as an open, clear source. The basic kasha, obviously, is the fact that I'm quoting this from the Ravya, not the Yerushalmi, because if we were to look in the Yerushalmi, it's not there. Not only is it not in the Yerushalmi in print, in the manuscripts of Yerushalmi, the famous Ksaviat Leiden, which is the manuscript that was at the base of our printed Yerushalmi, it's not there, so we're not talking about a printer's error. And it's not there in another manuscript, which we're lucky to have in the Maseches Brachos, the Vatican manuscript of the Yerushalmi. We have this entire sugi over here. You can see on the fourth line, Kadeshi Nikr Ben Atzvuin, theoretically where it would be fitting in, Ben Techeiles Love, Ben Techeiles Currency, and there's no mention of this. So obviously this detracts quite a bit from the authority of quoting it from Yerushalmi if we open up our Yerushalmi on the shelf and it's not there. Secondly, there's another problem, that this is not the only time that the Yerushalmi is quoted by the Ravya and it's not there in front of us. There are many, many quotations from the Ravya where the Ravya quotes the Yerushalmi, and it's not just the Ravya, it's a number of Rishonim and Ashkenaz who quote the Yerushalmi, and these quotations are not there. We don't have them in our Yerushalmi. This has led many scholars over the years. Just stand in front of me so I can talk to you. This has led many scholars over the years to the conclusion that when the Rishonim Ashkenaz are quoting the Yerushalmi, they're not talking about the Yerushalmi as we know it. They're talking about a different work based on the Yerushalmi, perhaps similar to the Rif being based on the Rif based on the Talmud Bavli, or some similar work. This theory was mainly popularized by Victor Aptevitzer, the one who first published the full Ravya. And every single time that the Ravya quotes Yerushalmi, he has a footnote, and he writes Sefer Yerushalmi. And his introduction, he explains at length that we're not talking about the Yerushalmi. We're talking about some work loosely based on the Yerushalmi, perhaps in the period of the Gainim, and therefore, obviously, not nearly as authoritative as the Yerushalmi itself. Even if it were the Yerushalmi, another question is raised, which is perhaps even stronger. That Yerushalmi that I read from the Rav Yod just says bein Techeiles the currency, bein Porphyrin and bein Perfinan. We have no way of knowing that the Yerushalmi is actually coming to translate the terms Techeiles and currency. As a matter of fact, if you look later in the Yerushalmi gives a number of other, and the Bavli too for that matter, a number of other ways to tell if the time of Mishiachar came, a number of other simanim perhaps. Mishiachar bein Kelev Lazev, Mishiachar bein Chamor La'ard, telling a wolf apart from a dog, which the Yerushalmi says is at the same time as Techeiles and Karasi. Mishiachar bein Chamor La'ard, between a donkey and a wild donkey. Being that we don't know what Perfinan is, perhaps Perfinan is something else, and Porphyrin is not Techeiles, and it's two other things, and not related to Techeiles and Karsi. Again, the question is whether we have a Yerushalmi, and the second question is, even if we do have a Yerushalmi, how do we know that it's coming to translate the terms mentioned by the Mishnah, bein Techeiles and Karsi? The first thing that we have to realize, to put this Yerushalmi in context, is the first thing that we have to realize is that these quotations from the Yerushalmi that we don't have in front of us are widely used by the Paiskim. Nearly every single time the Rav Yod brings Yerushalmi that I've checked, almost always they're accepted la'alocha l'maisa. One interesting example, which I didn't have a chance to upload to the screen, the Tefillah of Nachem, which we say on Tisha B'Av, the source of this is Yerushalmi. It's not in the Bavli. The Rambam doesn't even bring it. And the Yerushalmi says quite clearly that we say it in Ritzei. The reason why we, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, to the best of my knowledge, nearly every Kehillah and Klal Yisrael says it on Tisha B'Av as part of V'li Yerushalayim Ircha. The reason we do that is because of Yerushalmi, again quoted by the Rav Yod. But here this is uniquely interesting because the standard Yerushalmi clearly has it as part of Ritzei, and here we have Yerushalmi quoted only by the Rav Yod, not the Rav Yod, not the Yerushalmi that we have in front of it, and the authority of the Rav Yod's Yerushalmi supersedes the authority of the standard Yerushalmi, and this is accepted halacha l'maisa almost universally. The standard Yerushalmi, as a matter of fact, is quoted by the Mishnah Berurah in Biur Halacha in Hilchos Tisha B'Av, and he says that if one forgot to say it in V'li Yerushalayim Ircha, one should say it in Ritzei, as Yerushalmi says clearly, which would be the more likely place to put it, as we put in Yalav Yaveh, every Me'ina Ma'ir. But the Chavetz Chaim doesn't bring the possibility even that perhaps one should say it in Ritzei L'chatchila, just like it says in Yerushalmi. Another interesting example is the bracha of Hadlakas Ner Shel Shabbos. I think pretty much everyone in Klal Yisrael says the bracha, Hadlakas Ner Shel Shabbos. The Rishonim that bring it all quote it from Yerushalmi in Maseches Brachos, in Parak HaRoya, and it's not there. It's only from the Yerushalmi that the Rishoni Ashkenaz are quoting. If you check the halacha in Shulchan Aruch and you look at the Biur Agra, the main purpose of the Biur Agra is to give sources and Chazal for everything mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. He writes here that it's Yerushalmi Parak HaRoya. He doesn't even bother saying the Vilna Gaon there. Doesn't even bother saying that this is not in the Yerushalmi in front of us. He just says Yerushalmi Parak HaRoya. Obviously, the Vilna Gaon, who clearly would have known that this isn't in the Yerushalmi, no one would have been able to say this better than the Vilna Gaon, who had the entire Yerushalmi at instant command, and he just says Yerushalmi, straightforward. It's Yerushalmi and it's in Parak HaRoya, while he knew from the Beis Yosef that this is just Rishoni Ashkenaz quoting the Yerushalmi. I have another interesting source. I'm bringing it just because of the Chiddush. It's never been printed, to the best of my knowledge. This is a list of brachas that you see there from a little-known work of the Vilna Gaon called Ma'aseh Torah. It's a compendium of lists that the Vilna Gaon wrote. There are those that say that he wrote it while he was in jail. This manuscript that you see in front of you was written by the Vilna Gaon's son, Reb Shlomo Zalman ben Agra, who died during the Gra's lifetime, which means that this is written in the lifetime of the Gra. You have over here a list of brachas, bekitzer nimritz. You can see on the top, matar asurim zekiv kfufim reika arts, right? All the brachas that you would know. There's a lot of interesting things you could even dive from this, obviously. At the end of the list, one has v'oidiesh brachas. You can see it there highlighted. These are brachas that we don't find anywhere in Chazal. Brachas that we find from Gaonim, from other sources, but they're not there in Chazal. One of them there is Hanoisen L'Yav Kech, which, as a matter of fact, we have a Messiah quoted by the Vilna Gaon's nephew, Rav Yaakov Kahana, that the Vilna Gaon wouldn't say this because it's not there in Chazal. But up there, together with the brachas of Chazal, he quotes Ner Shel Shabbos and Ner Shel Yom Tov, which means that the Vilna Gaon clearly saw them as being part and parcel of Chazal. The reason the Vilna Gaon would have assumed this is probably because the Rishonim Ashkenaz quote it not as being a separate work, but as being a Chazal, part of the Gemara. They don't quote it as a work based in Yerushalmi. They always quote it as the Yerushalmi itself, like we saw there in the Ravya itself, where he says Garsinon b'Yerushalmi, which is the term that the Ravya only uses when quoting the Gemara itself. So it would stand to reason that, as far as halacha is concerned, the Poskim accept the authority of the Yerushalmi, these fragments of the Yerushalmi quoting Rishonim Ashkenaz, not as being a spurious source based on the Yerushalmi, or perhaps erroneously ascribed to the Yerushalmi, but rather as part of the Yerushalmi itself, and they're accepted la'alacha. Interestingly enough, over the last years, a number of manuscripts of the Yerushalmi came to light. They were found and published independently for the most part in the bindings of Sfarim of actually Christian books in libraries around Europe. And they were put together, published mainly by Professor Yaakov Zussman of Hebrew University. And these look like standard Yerushalmi. These are manuscripts of the Yerushalmi itself, found in Ashkenaz. We only have one other Ashkenazi manuscript, which only has parts of it. Obviously, this was of tremendous importance. Professor Yaakov Zussman pointed out something even more fascinating. We have a sum total of 12 pages, each one with 2 columns on either side. We're talking about a sum total of 48 columns. To our great luck, one of these columns overlaps with one of the quotations of the Rishonim Ashkenaz in the Yerushalmi that was never found in the Yerushalmi before us. In Maseches Beitza, the Rishonim Ashkenaz, among them the Ravya, the Mardachai, the Azrua, I think, quote the Seder of Erev Tavshilin, and this is brought la'alach l'maisa. They quote the Seder of Erev Tavshilin as being there in the Yerushalmi. Here we have it. It talks about Erev Tavshilin. I apologize, it's not very clear. I took this from Professor Zussman's article. And there you have it. How do you make an Erev? Neitel pas kebetza. This is paskin la'alocha that the bread has to be kebetza, and the whole seder. You say Shekeshanim says it's on mitzvahs erev, bahadei neruva, and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, this is referenced in the Taisus and Maseches Beitza. Do not beferish b'shem the Yerushalmi. What was it? One second, there's a technical problem. I see that the slides haven't switched. One moment, as the slides are uploaded, sorry. Oh, here we have it. Does everybody see that now? There you have it. This is the Yerushalmi that I was mentioning earlier. This is obviously a manuscript of the Yerushalmi itself. Not a work based on the Yerushalmi, not a compendium of sources, of quotes in the Yerushalmi. We're looking at the Yerushalmi itself, and they're incorporated into the Yerushalmi itself. We have highlighted the Seder of Erev Tavshilin as quoted by the Rishonim Ashkenaz. Being that we only have 48 columns, it's Hashkacha that we actually have one that overlaps with one of those quotations in Yerushalmi that we don't have, but here we have it. A quotation from the Yerushalmi that only the Ashkenazi Rishonim have, and as part and parcel of the Yerushalmi itself, the greater Yerushalmi, we have these quotations that only Rishonim Ashkenaz have. What Professor Zussman points out, based on a careful analysis of the rest of this manuscript, is that very, very often the Nusach, the text of the Yerushalmi over here in this Yerushalmi manuscript, is preferable to the standard Gersa of the Yerushalmi that we have in print. He has a number of ways of proving this, besides for better readings, but a number of places where these quotations, these fragments of Yerushalmi, these 48 columns that were found in these bindings, where they overlap with fragments of Yerushalmi found in the Karug Niza, often one finds that the text over here is far superior to the Gersa of the Yerushalmi in print. Therefore, Professor Zussman proposes that one shouldn't look at the Yerushalmi of the Ashkenazim as being a reworking of the Yerushalmi, but as an independent source of the Yerushalmi, an independent transmission of the Yerushalmi, and one would have to analyze, when we have a text of Yerushalmi quoting the Rishonim Ashkenaz, would have to analyze it on a case-by-case basis against the standard Yerushalmi to see which reading is preferable. Are we looking at something that's a Hisafa or a reworking the Yerushalmi, or perhaps another Gersa? Concerning our quotation that the Rav Yah had here, besides the fact that it's Greek terms which theoretically wouldn't have been used at a late Kufa and Ashkenaz, particularly, in order to see how well it fits in with the Yerushalmi, whether it looks like an integral part of the Yerushalmi, we would have to analyze, taking the other question that I raised in consideration. How does this piece fit into Yerushalmi? What are we looking at? Is this a translation or some alternate way of telling what this Man Kriya Shema is, in which case it might be a parenthetical marginal note? In order to learn this carefully, we're going to have to revisit that Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi in Brachos is talking about the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Me'emasai kairin nashma b'shachris," or b'shacharin, "Mishiyakar ben Techeiles the Lavan." From when can one read Kriya Shema? In the morning, when one can tell apart Techeiles from Lavan. Theoretically, I don't know, Techeiles, a piece of wool that's partially dyed Techeiles and partially dyed Lavan, or perhaps two components of tzitzis. Rebbe Lezer Eimer, ben Techeiles lekarton, between Techeiles and karton. Usually this is assumed just to be the plural of karsi, and karsi, those who eat it on Rosh Hashanah will know, karsan is simply Lashon Kodesh for leek. The Yerushalmi goes on to explain this, and the Yerushalmi says, where do we get this from? Keni Masnisin. This is how the Mishnah should be learned, should be read. Ben Techeiles the Shabbat Lavan Shabbat. What does Ben Techeiles the karsi mean? It means between the Techeiles in the tzitzis and the Lavan in the tzitzis. Where do we get that? The Yerushalmi continues, this is the beginning of Amud Beis here in the standard Prince Yerushalmi. Ma tamun derabanan. What's the reasoning of the Rabbanon? They learn it from a pasuk. We're Isam Oisei, and we have an asmachta that we're learning this from Parashas Tzitzis to the rest of Kriya Shema. At the time that you can discern the Techeiles particularly, or Isam Oisei, when you can see it particularly, that means you can see Techeiles. Now, one can see Techeiles even middle of the night without any lighting at all. Obviously, it means you're Isam Oisei, one can tell it apart, and the Yerushalmi goes on to explain, Minasamachloi, from the next available thing, the other ingredients in tzitzis, obviously the white of the tzitzis. What follows is, Umay time of the Rabbanon, the Rabbi Eliezer. What's the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer? Right? The Rabbanon have a good asmachta. We're Isam Oisei, to see particularly Techeiles, but not Techeiles in distinction from the other components of tzitzis, rather Techeiles as a unique dye, and you can discern Techeiles bein hatzavuim, until you can tell Techeiles apart from other dyed cloths, other dyed objects, when you can tell Techeiles apart from some other dyed object. And that's a karsan is. Now, the problem is obvious. The Rishonim understand this, the Aruch and the standard Mefarshim Yerushalmi do explain it, as I said, that bein hatzvuim is the other dyed objects, but kerosene is not a dyed object, it's a vegetable. Here, in my opinion, is where the Yerushalmi comes in. If we look at the Aviyah in the print, it says Gersinim Yerushalmi, right after he brings bein Techeiles alavan or blazer bein Techeiles karsi. So now the Aviyah explains this. What's karsi? Yesh min tseva shekarin karsi. There is a dye called karsi, and it's similar to Techeiles. But Gersinim Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi explains this. We learn in the Yerushalmi bein Techeiles karsi bein perfir bein prifinan. As I said, this doesn't seem to help us. If we look at the manuscripts of the Aviyah, however, we find a different gersa in the earliest manuscript of the Aviyah, and this gersa is quite obviously preferable. The Gersinim Yerushalmi, not bein Techeiles karsi, bein Techeiles karton, which is how we would have it in all the manuscripts of Yerushalmi, even in Karagin is a fragment of Yerushalmi, and many quotations of Yerushalmi. What follows is not bein perfirin bein prifinin. If you look carefully, it says bein purfirin ubein prisinan. What is prisinan? We have a pasuk in the Torah where it talks about the man zacharnu es, and the list of Klal Yisrael remembered. It continues ve'es hachotzir. What is chotzir? Targum over there says karte, karase, the leeks, right? So chotzir, which we know to mean leeks, is karsi, which you also know to mean leeks. So far, no chiddush. If we look at the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Tanakh, those of you who can read Greek can see over there it says kaita prasa, and the leeks. Prasa therefore means leeks, which means that this term prasinos means leek. If that weren't enough for us, we have the Aruch, the Gersa, the dictionary from early Tkufas Rishonim. Actually, the first Rishon we can easily date. He was born actually in Tkufas HaGaonim, I think. It says in the end, kares or karet, bein Techeiles karaton, or karata, and he explains that what is karata? Min tseva yirakrak, a green dye, ubelaz prasino. The Latin or Greek translation for that would be prasinos. So here we have a clear understanding in which the Yerushalmi is using a word, prasinos, seemingly as a Greek cloth. Here we have this in a encyclopedia of Greek and Roman clothing, as under the entry prasinos or prasinas, leek green or light green clothing, right? So once again, if we look back at the Yerushalmi, it seems quite obvious what we're looking at. We can easily integrate that piece from the Yerushalmi quoted by the Aviyah. I've seen it asked by a number of people who brought this Aviyah, an obvious question. Theoretically, everyone in Eretz Yisrael should have known what both Techeiles and karati are. If that's what Techeiles and karati are, why would the Yerushalmi go ahead to translate it? If we look at the Yerushalmi, though, in context, here we have the Yerushalmi as I would reconstruct it based on the quotation from the Aviyah. Keini masnisen bein Techeiles sheba lelavan sheba. Well, we're going to explain that Rabbi Eliezer is explaining that it's not between Techeiles and karati, not the vegetable karasi, which is widely known. It's between Techeiles and karaton, between Techeiles and a rarely used, as you saw in the dictionary, green dye known as karaton. So the Yerushalmi has to go ahead and explain that as bein purfirin ubein prisinan, between purfura, which is translating only b'darach agav, and prisinan, the leek green dye. No. As a leek green dye. And I think taken all in context, I think we've gotten what we've looked for way at the beginning. Here we have the smoking gun, the clear reference theoretically in the Yerushalmi itself, if not in the Yerushalmi, in a very early Eretz Yisraeli Gaonic source at the latest, in which the Yerushalmi is clearly translating, or this other source is clearly translating, Techeiles as being prefer. If there are any questions, I guess you can ask Rabbi Hecht. Any questions here? Okay, no questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Yeshua. So I'm going to go and ask you a
Mike's
question
not live.
and present it
I
through
can't hear.
Zoom. Okay, so
I can't hear.
Rafi, we can't hear.
sorry, do you hear me?
Huh?
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Now I could hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, you're muted.
So thank you, Rabbi Yeshua. So there actually are a couple of questions that that came in through Zoom. So I'm gonna throw them at you. One, it was actually two questions by a person named Josh Fogel. He's asking, and this was per earlier in what you were talking about. How about interpreting the Eruvin Daf 96b, that quote unquote Lashonis is referring to cloaks made not Lishma and owned by Jews. So I could argue that this is only a Jewish dye. This Lishma point is that tzitzis has to be made L'shem mitzvah, while cloaks clearly do not need to be made Lishma, since there is no mitzvah involved.
That's certainly likely. As a matter of fact, the Gemara was written in a Jewish setting, so my expectation would be that one would assume that it's Jewish. Why not? However, in spite of that, it still demonstrates that it wasn't used uniquely for the mitzvah. If there was another blue dye that was uniquely used for the mitzvah and this perfura dye, which looked identical, then the Gemara has another step that it would have to identify. There's the question of potentially finding non-Techeiles blue dye, which is identical to Kal Iyun, Techeiles Shaloi Lashma dye, which is also identical to Kal Iyun, indigo, or Techeiles itself, which means that the Gemara is missing an integral step. Secondly, even putting that aside, the second we established that it wasn't something that was uniquely used for Jews and for Jewish ritual purposes, there's no reason why it shouldn't have been widely known to non-Jews at the time. In which case, we should find mention in this other blue dye in the non-Jewish sources, contemporary non-Jewish sources, considering the fact that they mention many other dyes, including dyes that were made here in Eretz Yisrael, which leaves the question again, the glaring question: how could it be that there are two dyes? Why don't we find this? If there was a unique Jewish dye, which is used only for ritual purposes, I could perhaps explain that away, that the Goyim didn't know about it and it was something uniquely used in the Beis Hamikdash, perhaps, or for a select few Yidden who wore tzitzis, perhaps. The second we established that Jews are using it for cloaks too, there's no reason non-Jews shouldn't know about it.
Okay.
Is that understood? Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, there's one more question by another guy, Aaron, on also on Zoom. I once experimented with dyeing Techeiles. I found that if at the end of the process I boiled up the wool, the color held really strong and didn't fade when soaked in water and ironed out. But without boiling it, it did fade. In the Gemara, part of the instructions is to boil the ingredients, right? Perhaps this is me'akev.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. Baruch Shekivanti, when I made tzitzis the first time, I pointed out to Joel Gruberman that I'd like to have my tzitzis boiled, and he told me that we've been doing that for a long time already, simply because otherwise the strings don't hold well. I don't know if you realized, even after you cut the strings, they usually don't unravel, even though it was dyed. The reason for that is that the strings are stretched carefully on a frame, dropped into a vat of boiling water, and that's what both keeps the color extra steadfast and the strings well wound. So yes, Baruch Hashem, we've been doing that.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Yeshua. Very,
Okay.
very, very fascinating, and it's great to hear from you, and great to see you in person. So I'm going to move over to the next speaker. Okay, so just give me a sec here. Okay, so now last but certainly not least, Rabbi Ben Sion Avram Yaakov Halberstam is not to be confused with the Baba Rebbe of the same name. He serves Cal Hasidim in Westgate, which is in Lakewood, New Jersey, and is a posek in his own right. Again, questions can be asked either through the various social media channels that this event is being streamed, as well as if you're, let's say, watching, as well as in Zoom. If you're watching it, let's say on Torah Anytime, right, where comments are not available, you are able to present questions using a contact form on techeiles.org/QA, and after Rabbi Halberstam speaks, questions will be asked through that means as well. Okay, so I'm going to go and add Rabbi Halberstam to the stream here. Okay, welcome Rabbi Halberstam.
Hello, and it's good to be part of this very important event. I would like first to express my hakudas hatoiv for my friend, Rafi Hecht, even though we've never met, but we're friends because there's something that we have very much in common. Actually, all Yidden have it in common. It says, Kihaim Chayayni, the Torah is our life, which means it's our very essence. So while, Goyim have all kinds of things, by the Yidden, those all kinds of things are just secondary, and our very essence is the Torah. It's what brings us together, it's what makes us one, and it's what creates the love that exists in Klal Yisrael. I will also mention that there is an interesting thing from the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Netzate. He talks about the Milchamta Shel Torah, and he says that we find that Talmidei Chachomim argue, and sometimes it appears as though they're arguing very vehemently, and it looks as though there's some sort of a shall we say, a lack of enough love that should exist between Yidden. But he says that the purpose of the Milchamta Shel Torah is because really every Yid, in essence, knows the Torah. It says a similar thing in Balatanya, in one of his letters at the end of the Sefer, that L'usid Lovoi, when there won't be a Yetzer Hara, all of the Yidden will know the Torah just by their very nature, because it's in our neshama. The Torah is part of our neshama. We know the Torah, we feel it. But because we have the Nisyonis, we have the Yetzer Hara, that's what gets in our way, all the Midas Ruis. It creates some sort of, it colors our judgment, so that when we sit down to learn a shtickle Gemura, a piece of Gemura, we might not understand the Gemura. We might have a kash on the Gemura. It's because our mind is not clear because of all the extra things that are presented to us through the Yetzer Hara. So obviously, no two people have the same nisyonis. Everybody's Yetzer Hara presents a bit differently. So when two people learn together, and somebody feels that the other person is just simply not right, what he's saying is wrong, I can feel it's wrong, and obviously it's rooted in the other person with some sort of a fallacy, some sort of a pigam in his midas, which is caused by the Yetzer Hara. So therefore, I'm going to fight it. I'm going to help him in his melchumah that he has against his Yetzer Hara, and I'm going to help him fight it by explaining to him that this is wrong. And if he will make it a goal to know the Torah L'amita, to know the real truth of the Torah, then he will rise above that chesurim that he has, and he will cleanse himself of that piece of Yetzer Hara. In particular, when it comes to the issue of Techeiles, there's a lot that we have to overcome. And I find that, when I originally started studying this, it took me a couple of months. I really feel I left no stone that I came across, uncovered. And I went through it, I considered all possibilities. But the first thing I had to do, because I knew that if I'm going to conclude that this Techeiles is emes, I'm going to have to wear it. And it's not going to be easy, because I'm going to stand out among my family, among my society. People have told me that it's going to cause harm to me in many different ways, that I'm going to be considered some sort of an unusual type of a person. And I usually like being a traditional person. So in order to actually allow myself to see this for what it is and to study it objectively without any bias, I had to say, listen, what I'm doing now is I'm studying the actual material, the actual subject. It's not relevant how I feel about it and what it's going to cause me to do. That'll come later. and I put my biases aside, and I actually got into the crux of the matter. When I finished working through all the sources and all of the proofs, and I concluded that this is certainly beyond any reasonable doubt the emissary Techeiles, the last step that I had was to see what is it that the opponents say. I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who don't wear Techeiles, and they're saying that this Techeiles is not the real Techeiles. What are they saying? What are their arguments? It seems to me so clear. I don't see any room to argue. And in fact, when I went into the into some of their arguments, it just confirmed that the Techeiles is emes, because they have no arguments of substance, I'm sorry to say. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it seems to me very clearly that the arguments are presented because their judgment, they don't really have room. They would have a problem. If they would conclude that this is Techeiles, they would have to wear it. And that's something that they have a hard time facing. And therefore, the only way they can face themselves to say, well, I'm not mechiyev because it's not Techeiles. And therefore, by hook or by crook, that will be the conclusion. And, when you see some of the kashas, which I hope to get to some of the kashas at the end of this discussion, you'll see that, in any other hilchise, such kashas would quickly be dismissed. Only here, when it comes to Techeiles, because of the difficulty that presents itself in being mekayem the mitzvah, so therefore these kashas are allowed, even by Talmidei Chachomim, to become part of the discussion. So I have a request. I'm going to be going through some of the things. Obviously, it took me a couple of months to study this, and I'm only going to be speaking for just one short speech. But I'm going to try to get through some of the essential points of the discussion. And I'm asking you, please listen with an open heart. And please listen with just putting the negiyas, the biases aside, and trying to accept and hear the material for what it is. So I'm going to go in an order like this. First of all, people ask a question. The Radzina was mentioned earlier in this event. The Radzina was a Rebbe, a Berliner, and he was a big Talmid Chochem and a tzaddik, and he pretty much said with certainty that he has discovered Techeiles. And the Gedolim of his time, for the most part, didn't agree with him. And later, it came to be understood what his mistake was, and that basically his Techeiles is probably not the correct Techeiles. So people say, look, here you have somebody who is a great Talmid Chochem, and he said with certainty that, the cuttlefish is the chaluzah. And he turned out to be wrong. So now here you are, and you're saying that the Murex trunculus is the chaluzah. So at some point, somebody will say that you're wrong. So when a person is sure, I don't know if we can necessarily go by that just because you say that you're sure. So the first thing I would like to do is go through there is a basic difference between the way that the Radzina Rebbe determined that the cuttlefish is the Techeiles, is the chaluzin of the Techeiles, to the way that we today know that the Murex trunculus is the Techeiles. It's totally by a totally different method of learning, and the method that we have today is mechayev, it's conclusive, and it doesn't leave any room for doubt. Not so by the chaluzin of the Radzina, as we will discuss. And then I will actually get into what the rayas are, that the Murex trunculus is the chaluzin of the Techeiles. And then there's another element which I think is very important, and that is that some people feel that, it's very hard to put on Techeiles, when we live in a society with other people and we try to conform, as I mentioned earlier. So, there are a lot of mitzvahs that we can be mehadeh. There's a hiddah mitzvah. I can make more mehiddik tefillin, and I could have a mehiddik liliv and esrig. When it comes to tzitzis, I'm not going to do the most mehid. I'll be yoitze with kusher tzitzis that are luvon, and I'm not going to do the hiddah of Techeiles. So obviously, that seems to be missing a very important piece of information, and that is that the chiyuv of wearing Techeiles, it's a chiyuv guma. It's not optional. It's a requirement. Just like if a person doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, he's being mevatel mitzvah sesa. The same way if a person doesn't wear Techeiles, he's being mevatel mitzvah sesa, just the same. And we don't have the option to say that we would rather abstain. We would rather not be of the Techeiles wearers. So that's something I'll get into a little bit just to show that that's the way it is. And then we'll try to go through some of the kashas that people ask. And then there's an issue of misoira, where some people say that we can only be mekayim a mitzvah if it's been passed on to us in a traditional way from generation to generation, whereas this mitzvah is something that we rediscovered on our own. So that's not mechayev us. We'll get into that discussion. And with that, I don't think we'll get into anything more, even though there are other things to talk about. But I think that'll be pretty much the discussion for today. So the first thing is the Radzina Techeiles. So let's start with this. We have one source in Chazal which tells us what the tzitzis has to be made, the Techeiles has to be made of. And it says, Techeiles einik shaire eile min hachaluzain. The Techeiles is only kusha if it is made of the chaluzah. Also, shalom and chaluzah psila. If it's not the chaluzah, it's pusel, it's not kusha Techeiles. So what is a chaluzah? That's the question. So you have a Gemur in Menuchas brings a braise. Chaluzah zei gifoy doime liyom, ebriyusay doime ledog, va'oyle echad l'shivim shuna, v'dumay tzoyvim Techeiles, lefichach dumav meribben. This chaluzah, the chaluzah, its gif, its body, resembles the yam, it resembles the sea. It's briyusoi, which I suppose it means its physique somehow, resembles a fish. It emerges once in 70 years. With its blood, we dye Techeiles, and that's why it's expensive. So the Radzina wanted to take this braise and try to figure out on the basis of these simunim that are given here that it's similar to the sea and it's similar to a fish. So let's try to see if we can figure out what that must be. So he said, what does it mean? Chaluzan zei gifoy doim eliyom. What does it mean that we say its gif is doim eliyom? Its body is similar to the sea. So Rashi says it means mare gifoy, the appearance of its gif is doime to the sea. The word appearance could mean color. It doesn't necessarily mean color. But the Radzina said that it means mare gifoy hi mare Techeiles. The color of its body is the color of the Techeiles. And then he said that the cuttlefish has that color, so that means that it's the cuttlefish. Now, I'll say that the Gedolim of his time did not find this to be any conclusive evidence that it is the cuttlefish. First of all, if anyone knows anything about the cuttlefish, it's not blue. It could turn blue because it has a feature that a lot of octopus types of creatures have. It's like a chameleon. It changes colors. It blends into its environment. It could look like the seabed. It could look like a coral reef. It could look like lots of things. And I guess sometimes it might turn blue. But that's not to say that its color is generally blue. So b'chalal, the whole idea that he took this to mean that it's the cuttlefish is a bit hard to understand. But then, even if we would give him that given, naniach, that it's blue. So how many sea creatures would you say there are that are blue? I would say in the tens of thousands. I mean, there are millions of creatures in the sea. So how could this be a determining siman to show us what the chaluzan is? Then he went to the next thing that says in the Braise, that the Gemur brings, Briyusoi doime ledog. So Rashi says, Tavn is the yiknoi. It's gestalt, it's physique. Really, it would seem that these are not necessarily given as simunim to identify the chaluzin for people who don't know what the chaluzin is. Because if somebody doesn't know what the chaluzin is, he doesn't know the definition of the word chaluzin, it's hard to imagine that from these simunim, from saying that its appearance is like the sea and its physique is like a fish, so suddenly I'm going to be able to identify it. It would more seem maybe that the Braisa had a different intention by saying these things. Maybe I give one idea, which is not necessarily the case, but it's just an idea. Maybe just like it says that the Techeiles is doime liyom, and the Techeiles itself looks like the sea because it's there to remind us that the sea is doime to the sky and the sky is doime to the kisa hakuvit. So maybe the Braisa wants to tell us that the actual gif of the chaluzin has that resemblance. It reminds us of the sea from beginning to end. So it's doime liyom. I guess it has a resemblance to the sea, maybe by the fact that it is in the sea. that it's a sea creature, so in that sense it resembles the sea, or maybe some other way that it resembles the sea. And it's like a fish. So again, it's something that reminds us of the sea. I'm not saying that that's necessarily pshat, but it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's as good of a pshat as any other pshat that we have so far, where we try to say that these simunim are somehow going to help us figure out what it is when these simunim are so vague. But the Radzina said that doimel dog means it's like a fish. So he says, Rakis besuroi v'hilichoi b'mayim al yidai snapirov, the softness of its flesh and the way it moves around in the water through its fins, doimel dog is like a fish. Anyone who sees this interpretation kind of is left wondering, like, it's like a fish, it's soft like a fish, and it swims around like with fins. Like how did he conclude from that it means the cuttlefish? It's just not to be understood. Additionally, he says that there's a medrash that says on the pusik, it says "Leibuli sal noisaychem," your clothing didn't get used, it didn't get rubbed out, it didn't get worn all the time that we were in the midbar. And it says that the children, when they were young, they had clothing, and the clothing grew together with them. So the Medrash says it's like the shell of a chaluzon. It's like the clothing, like the house of a chaluzon. That just like the chaluzon, as it grows, its cloak grows with it. So the people in the midbar, as they grew, their clothing grew with them. So the Radzina says that the cuttlefish has some sort of a skin, which is some sort of maybe a hardish type of skin, which grows along with the actual cuttlefish. Again, I don't understand what he means to say by this, because as far as I know, every organism's skin grows with it. But if we're going to say that it means, a snail, a murex snail, then it is well understood, because the shell of the snail seems like a doimim. It seems like an inanimate object, even though it does in fact grow, and it, obviously it has some life to it, like a bone. But the way it appears as though it's like a house, it's a shell, and you have a snail inside, which the snail can move around, and sometimes it goes almost completely out of its shell, and then it goes back in. It's like baisa, it's like its home. It's not like part of an organism that has a skin. And that's similar. That could be sometimes compared to clothing, that, to say that the clothing grew with the children, just like the shell of the chaluzon grows together with the actual slug that's inside the shell. And there are those that actually use this as some sort of a raya or a siman, that it means a snail, that it means a murex type of snail. But the Radzina, who uses these kind of simunim to figure out and to conclude that it is the cuttlefish, is really hard to understand. Most likely because the cuttlefish was known to have a secretion of some sort of an ink. It was called the tint fish, which means the ink fish. So he figured that's probably the source of an ink, is probably the source of a dye. And therefore he kind of, worked it through so that the simunim of Chazal should at least not contradict, and maybe even indicate somewhat that it is the cuttlefish. But certainly the Gedolos Manoi didn't see this as any conclusive evidence. They said it's a hashura ba'alma. It's nothing more than a guess to say that it's the cuttlefish. It could just likely be anything else. Now, when it comes to the murex trunculus, the way we know it's the murex trunculus is not because we are trying to interpret the simunim that the Gemara brings here. Because if we would try to interpret those simunim, then it's open to interpretation. One person can interpret it this way, and someone can interpret it differently. So who's to say that it's necessarily correct the way we would interpret it? But it's different. The way we know is we start to try to see what does the word chaluzin mean? And that will point us in the right directions. Well, if a chaluzin has a meaning, if it's a word, and it has a meaning, then whatever that means, that is something that we have to consider as being the source of the chaluzin, of the Techeiles. That is the chaluzin. Additionally, we find other things which point directly. In other words, we're not going through simunim. We're going through means of where we find sources who directly point to this species and say, this is what we used for the Techeiles. This is the chaluzin. So it's not something that's open to interpretation because it's been clearly identified. So the first means of identification is to know what the word chaluzin means. And again, because we say that the chaluzin, we have the only source, as we mentioned earlier, to say what the Techeiles has to be is that it has to be from a chaluzin. So if we know the definition of the word chaluzin, which, as I'll show you now, it means a snail, then we can conclude basically from this brayso that if something is a snail and it gives a dye, and the dye is the correct color, then it is kusha for Techeiles, because that's the only t'nai that we find in Chazal. We don't have any other sources of halucha besides Chazal, and if Chazal only give us this one t'nai, this one rule, this one caveat of what the color's source has to be from, then we know that if we meet that criteria, then it's kusha. So anything which is a chaluzin and it produces the Techeiles color would be kusha for Techeiles. So how do I know that the word chaluzin means a snail? There are lots of ways of knowing. First of all, we'll start with this. I mean, I'm not going in any particular order. All of the proofs are just as good. But when you have a multitude of proofs, it kind of proves it in a very conclusive way. Like it's not possible to dismiss it because it's just proven from all different angles. So there was somebody who was a Rishon, and he wrote a dictionary soon after the Rambam. He was born a couple of years after the Rambam was nifta, and he writes a dictionary to define the words that we find in the Rambam. And his name was Reb Tanchem Yerushalmi. And under the entry Chaluzin, he writes that it is the same as what is called in Arabic al-Khalazon. So in Arabic, the word al-Khalazon or Khalazon happens to mean a snail. The same way as in Assyriac, which is the modern Aramaic, to this very day, the word Khalazon means a snail. So the word Khalazon seems to mean a snail, unless you want to say that somehow the words, the language somehow changed over the years. But it's quite likely that the word Khalazon from this alone means a snail. We find in the Sefer Urach, there was somebody around 200 years ago who put in Yiddish touch into the entries of the Urach, and under the word Chaluzin, he writes the word Schneck. Schneck is the word in Yiddish, in German, for snail. So he says that Chaluzin is a snail. There's a Sefer Teves Uretz, which was also a little under 200 years ago. He defines the word Choymet, which is a Lushan Kodesh word. He says it is al-Chalazon, and he says from there we know that the Chaluzin of Techeiles is a type of a Choymet, and he writes it is a Schneck, it is a snail. The Chaluzin is a snail, he writes. He writes that the same thing we find, he uses the medrash that I mentioned earlier, that it says that the clothing grew together with the children. So he uses that as some sort of an indication that it must probably be the snail. But in any case, he says that from the fact that the word is Chaluzin, which Chaluzin means a shnek, a snail, so that's how we know that the Chaluzin of Techeiles is a snail. In the Parashat Mishnayos Rambam, there's a Mishnah in Keilim. It says, "Shalsheles shekusha Chaluzin beroisha temaye." You have a chain that they tied a Chaluzin at one end, so it describes such a Chaluzin. The Rambam in the Parashat Mishnayos calls the Chaluzin a tzadafa, which the word tzadafa means a seashell. So again, the word Chaluzin is defined as being a creature which is in a seashell. Rashi in Avodah Zarah Daf Chuf Ches, there's the word Mishkide Chaluzine, where the word Chaluzin is used. Rashi says limits belaz. Limits is a French word, and it means a snail. I looked it up in an old French dictionary, the oldest dictionary I was able to find, which was from the 17th century. But if somebody doesn't want to necessarily rely on a dictionary, even though a dictionary is quite a good thing, but we also find the word limtze used by other Rishonim, and Rashi in Shabbos Daf Ayin Zayin, where it says shablil. Shablil is also a snail. It says Nepuzik shablil temes yalach. The word shablil means a snail. And Rashi says limtze also, the same word, the same French word. And the Gus Habach says limtze is a shnek, is a snail. So therefore we know that the word Chaluzin, which is defined as meaning limtze, or limits means a snail. The word chaluzain is the same as shablil and choimet. We find the medrash that I mentioned earlier, Loibuli Sal Mesaichem. It's quoted in Rashi. He brings the medrash. He says the medrash, as we look it up in our medrash that we have, it says a chaluzain azeh. The chaluzain, as it grows, its levish grows with it, its clothing grows with it. Rashi brings it. He says a choimet. He exchanges the word chaluzain for the word choimet. The same medrash. He just uses a more familiar word. You have the Rosh. Perish Rosh al Torah, he uses the word shablil. Shablil and choimet and chaluzin is the same thing. You have the Sefer HaSherushim from Rabbi Yoine, Ben Janach maybe. This was a very early Rishon. He was about 1,000 years ago. Other Rishonim bring him. And under the entry, Shein Bais Lamed, he brings the word shablil. And he says shablil is probably the same as chaluzain. So therefore, if we know what shablil is, which is a shnek, so we know chaluzin is a shnek. We have the Marie Koyen, which was a son-in-law of the Maral Miprag. On Medrash Tilim, he writes, Chaluzain, choimet. Chaluzain is a choimet, which is a snail. I already mentioned the Sefer Teves Ugatz, where he says choimet is a shnek. Rashi, he says, choimet ani oime, it's a mean sheirat shikoyin limtze, just in case, we want to see. The Bach says that the limtze is a snail, but Rashi says limtze is something which is gudal beklipe, it grows in a shell. It goes and it goes in circles around and around as much as it grows. Kol kamish gudal. So again, we have the Radak that on the word choimet, he says choimet is a sheretz which is called limtze. He says the word shablil also means a limtze. So whenever we find the word limtze in the Rishonim, as I mentioned, in the Rabbeinu Gershon in B'choires Daf Lamed Ches says chaluzain is a limits. So therefore we know that the word limtze is the same as a choimet, it's a snail. So from all of these proofs, we know that the word choimet is a snail. There are more proofs. That's going to come soon. Those are more conclusive proofs, which are in direct referring to the chaluzin of the Techeiles. But here I'm just referring in general to the word chaluzin, which means a snail. It's hard to say different after you see all of these sources that the word chaluzin means a snail. So the word chaluzin means a snail. So here we have a snail, which we know was used as a dye, and it does serve. It can be used as a dye. It has a dye in it. It can make the Techeiles. It makes the Techeiles color, and we can dye wool with it. And it's kusha for Techeiles because that's what the Tosefta says. And Techeiles is einig shayredim and chaluzin. That is the only prerequisite. It's the only t'nai that we have to say what Techeiles has to be. There is more, and that is that we have Gedolim, who actually said clearly that the Murex has another name. It's also called Pilpira. Pilpira is an old Greek word. It was already mentioned earlier in this event by some of the other speakers. It means the Murex. We find in some of the works of the older Chachmei Imis Oilam, Aristotle and Pliny, the word Pilpira is used interchangeably with the word Murex. It's the same thing. We find even today the word Pilpira is used in some places where they still use the a murex snail to dye. I recently found out there's a place in South America called Oaxaca, and they actually do still dye with the dye that comes out of a murex, and they call it purpura. So obviously the word purpura is the same as the word murex. That's the same thing. And the purpura is something that it's a word that has not gotten lost over the generations. It's something that's been used throughout history, and it continues to mean the same thing to this very day. And it means a snail. It means a murex snail. Now we have Gedoyla Kadmoinim. We have the Shilta Geboirim, which was a cipher that gets quoted by Tosis Yontif, some places, and other Gedolim. He was in Shein Ayin Bais over 400 years ago. He writes that he talks about he says, Belushin Yuvon, Remes Hayom Hanikre Pirper. There is a creature of the sea which is called Pirper. Vehi HaChaluzan Shetzoivim Boi Techeiles. That is the Chaluzan that we died Techeiles out of. You have the Teves Ra'aim, which is a parish on the Yerayim from the year Tufreishni Bais, and he writes the Chaluzan, the HaChaluzan Shetzoivim Bedumei Techeiles. Nikri Chaluzan Adoimi Pirpir Shneke. The Chaluzan that we dyed Techeiles is called Chaluzan Adoimi. It's Pirpir Shneke, the Pirpire snail. Reb Shamshel Fugel Hirsch used the same word Pirpir Shneke when he on the Pusi Kishefa Yamam Yunuki he talks about the Chaluzan which was in the Chaylik of Zevin, and he said it's called the Chaluzan is called Pirpir Shneke, the Pirpir snail. The Yavitz, the Reb Yankiv Emden, he brings some of the things from the Chachmei Masoilim, from the historians, from the Goyish historians, in connection to the Tzaida, the capturing of the Chaluzan, and he writes that this Chaluzan was found. Mesilme de Tzov ad Haifa, the same as our Gemara Masechtes Shabbos says that the Nevizaradon left over Yidden to create dye out of the Chaluzon, Mesilme de Tzov ad Haifa, in order to create Malbishim for the king. And in those areas, that's where the Chachmei Masoilim write that that's the source of the Chaluzan. Techeiles was made over there, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden says that to which the historians, the history books, the Goyish history books refer, that is the same as the Chaluzan of the Techeiles. The same thing is in the Radal, in his parish in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, where he also writes the same thing, that the Pirpire is the same thing that the Chachmei Masoilim talk about, and that's the Chaluzan of the Techeiles. Additionally, we have a Chavas Yuir, who was one of the very earlier Achroinim, and he writes, the Dam Chaluzan Sheboy Tzoiv and Techeiles, the blood of the Chaluzan, out of which we dyed Techeiles. I know blue. It's not blue, Raktseva Pirper. It's the color Pirper. I guess he means purple. Shenase Midam Dog Shenikra Hadam Pirper. It's made out of a type of a sea creature, which is called Pirper. So he's saying that the actual blood, the actual secretion as it comes out isn't blue, even though the final product of the Techeiles is blue, but the blood of the Chaluzan isn't blue. It starts off as being purple, as we had already seen earlier in this event where some of the previous speakers spoke about that and showed how originally when it comes out of the Chaluzan it's purple, and then later through the correct process of processing the Techeiles, it gets its correct color of Techeiles, of blue. So you have the Chavas Yuri who identifies it. He says it's Pirper, and he even describes a little bit of the process, and when it comes out the blood isn't blue, it starts off as purple. We have the Ramban ala Teure, which he doesn't say beferish, but it seems to be a good indication. He says in Parashat Tetzaveh, where the Torah mentions Techeiles, he says that Techeiles, until this very day, nobody would dare to wear it except for the Melech Goyim. And we know that the Ramban in other parts of the Torah, he said Melech Goyim refers to the Melech Roimi. It's known that there was exire, there was a decree against a person who's not of royalty to wear a garment that's dyed with Techeiles. It was reserved only for royalty, and there were times that it was even punishable by death if somebody else would try to wear Techeiles. So the Ramban says that there's Techeiles, even to this very day, I guess even in his time, there was the Byzantine Empire, which continued not to allow people to wear Techeiles. It was reserved for the royalty. So it seems to be an indication. He says it's something which is reserved for the Melech Goyim. So I guess he's referring to that. But in any case, all of these other sources besides the Ramban are much clearer, where they directly point to that which the Chachmei Masoilim refer, and they directly say that that is the Chaluzan of the Techeiles, and it's called Pirpira. So, in this sense, it's not similar at all to the way the Radzina identified the Chaluzan. Over here, we're identifying it because the word Chaluzan means a snail, and this is a snail. So it's directly identified. It's not identified through a simon, through some sort of a proof. It's identified because it's been pinpointed and described as what it is. The same is with all of these achronim that I mentioned. They clearly say that the Chaluzan at Techeiles is the Pirpira. So it's not a simon, it's somebody directly identifying and saying this is what it is. So that's conclusive. It doesn't leave any room for ambiguity. There's no suffix here. There's no room to say maybe we can interpret things differently. There's no interpretation. It's a direct identification of what the Chaluzan is. Therefore, nobody could say that the Chaluzan is not the Pirpira, because if he would do so, he would be arguing on all of these Gedolim. And there's no reason to argue. It seems that that's what it is from, it's the conclusion, the logical conclusion that anyone would come to. But even if a person would think differently, who has the authority to argue with all of these Gedolei Yisroel, the Chavas Yair, and Rabbi Yankiv Emden, all of the ones that I mentioned? And one might say, well, maybe there are other Achronim who maybe say differently. There aren't any other Achronim. There's nobody else who identified the Chaluzin as being anything else besides the Pepira, except for the Radzina. And the Radzina was clearly, disproven, and the Gedolei Zmanoi did not agree with him. So besides that, nobody else gave any other identity for the Chaluzin. And here you have a Gedolei Kadmoinai Achronim who say what it is. So that's it. So therefore, that is the Chaluzin. So that's how we know that the Murex Trunculus is a kosher source for Techeiles, the kosher source or a kosher source for the Techeiles. Now we're going to get into the discussion that it is a Chiyuv Gum. If Techeiles is available, we are mechiv, we are obligated to put on the Techeiles onto our talis, onto our tzitzis. First of all, it says in the Torah, it says we should wear tzitzis, vusidam tzitzis, al kanfa b'gdam the rest of, and v'nosni al tzitzis akunaf tzedchayles. Why would I say that it's not a chiyuv gumah? Just like it tells you to wear the tzitzis. The Rambam says that the mitzvah has two tziviyim. Nimtze b'mitzvah zi shnai tziviyim. One is sha'oisa al akunaf unaf hayotzim menu. You make some sort of an unaf, a branch that comes out of it of strings. And the next tzivi is sheyichach al unaf chit chayles. She'neima v'usilam tzitzis v'nosni al tzitzis akunaf tzedchayles. The Rambam doesn't say that there's any difference, that one is a chiyuv, one isn't a chiyuv. It's a chiyuv. We have the Braise that says, the punishment for somebody who doesn't wear luvon, he doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, is bigger than the punishment of somebody who wears luvon but doesn't wear tchayles. And he gives a mushal, the Ramai gives a mushal, the melech, busa v'dam, a king. He tells two of his servants. To one of them, he says, "Bring me a chosim shel tit, bring me a seal of tit, a stamp made out of clay." And to the other one, he says, "Bring me a seal made out of gold." So both of them don't fulfill the command of the king. So the one who was supposed to bring a seal made out of clay, he gets a much bigger punishment because clay is a cheap thing; anyone could get it. So the fact that he didn't bring it is a clear rebellion against the king. It's a very serious offense. Whereas the person who doesn't bring the golden seal, so he's also rebelling against the king. He didn't obey the words of the king. But you can say it was a little bit more difficult because gold is expensive and it's harder to get hold of. So he gets punished for not obeying the king, but the punishment is not as severe. It's not as big as the punishment for someone who doesn't wear tzitzis altogether. This is the same thing here with Techeiles and Luvon. Techeiles, as I mentioned before, it says dum of meribben. It's very expensive. It's not so easy to get. Luvon is just simple strings of wool. It's very easy to get. It's very cheap, inexpensive. So if somebody doesn't wear tzitzis altogether, it's like not wearing a mitzvah that's so easy to do. If somebody doesn't put on Techeiles, it's a little harder, so the punishment is less. When the Gemara says there's a punishment, obviously it's a chiyuv. It's not optional. It's an obligation to put the tzitzis, to put the Techeiles on the talis. We have the Gemara that says the Malach found Rav Ketina, and Rav Ketina used to always wear clothing that's made out of linen because there was exire that you're not allowed to put Techeiles onto a clothing that's made out of linen because we might come to put it onto a night garment, which is puta from tzitzis, and then it'll be shatnez because the Techeiles is wool, and the linen Techeiles with linen with wool together is shatnez. It's an issa. So they made exire that on a beged, on an article of clothing which is linen, we shouldn't wear Techeiles. So the Malach, founder of Ketina, he said, you're always wearing linen clothing. In the winter, you're wearing winter clothing that's linen. In the summer clothing that's linen. What's going to be with Techeiles? So Rav Ketina says, they punish. And Shisa, Esa, they punish for mitzvahs Esa. If someone's not Mekayim, a positive commandment, there's a punishment. So Tosfos says, what do you mean? Of course there's a punishment. It says that if a person doesn't want to be Mekayim, a mitzvah, you have to force him and you hit him, you beat him until he dies. Of course there's a punishment. The person's obligated to be Mekayim, and it says. So Tosfos says, yeah, but if a person could avoid ever becoming obligated if he doesn't wear an article of clothing that has four corners. So if Ketina said, listen, I'm wearing an article of clothing which is not mechiv b'tzitzis, because the chachumim, just like if you don't wear four corners, the same way if you wear linen, the chachumim exempt us from putting Techeiles onto it. So therefore, I'm puta. So what punishment is there? So the Malach said, well, it's not right that you're trying to find ways. Tachbilos means to try to get out, to weasel your way out of having to be Mekayim a mitzvah. So in a time when Hashem is scrutinizing and looking very carefully, and there's a time of anger in the world, then Hashem will punish for somebody, even if he's not violating a mitzvah, but if he's trying to avoid being Mekayim a mitzvah this way, there would be a punishment. But we see from here that if we would not do a tachbil, if we would wear a beged, which is not exempt from Techeiles, then Teves said, of course there's a punishment. You force a person like that to put on Techeiles. Additionally, we have there's a lot. I don't know if I should go through all of the proofs, but we have the Gemara in Shabbos where it says that the Talmidim of Rabbi Hida Rebbe Lua, they came, they found Erev Shabbos, they found him after he prepared himself for Shabbos. They found him, he was wearing sardinim, which are made out of linen, together with tzitzis, Techeiles, the pashtus, it means the machloikis or the shoinim, whether it means Techeiles or it means stam tzitzis. And the Talmidim didn't wear because they were afraid of the gzaira, mishim ksis laila, the gzaira that a person might put Techeiles onto a linen garment, which is a night garment, which is exempt from tzitzis. So therefore, they held that the Chechumim paskin, that they exempt this beged from tzitzis, from Techeiles. So Rabbi Lewis said to them, didn't I teach you that a sadin betzitzis, an article of clothing which is made out of linen, bishamai poitren, bishamai patis from tzitzis, basil mechayiv, basil is mechayiv, daluch is like basil. So they say, yes, true. It's true that daluch is like basil, that it's essentially chayiv, but it's puta because there's exayre mishim ksis lail. So there's a machlokes of shoinim. What are we talking about? Are we talking about wearing tzitzis all together, that the gzaira is even on luvon, so they didn't wear tzitzis all together? And then, we wouldn't necessarily have an indication from here that there's a chiyuv, there's basil and mechayiv, they're mechayiv to wear, and then maybe they're mechayiv to wear tzitzis to begin with, just tzitzis of luvon. But there's another pshat in Teves, brings a shiva of Rashi, where he says that, of course they wore tzitzis of luvon. But the question here is about tzitzis of Techeiles. That was the question. On tzitzis of Techeiles, if you don't wear it, if you have an article of clothing made out of linen, you're not puta from luvon, but you are puta from Techeiles. And on that, Rabbi Rebbe said to them, the basil is mechayiv, and they agreed, yes, it's mechayiv, but they exempt us when it comes to a beged of linen. We're only mechayiv with other begudim that are not linen, because when it comes to linen, we have exayre mishim ksis lail. So, who are the Rishonim who say it means Techeiles? So, as we mentioned, it's the chief of Rashi, also the Rif, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ran, the Meiri, the Toysus Rosh. All of these Rishonim say it means Techeiles. So from all these Rishonim, you see Basil Mechayiv, and it's a Chiv Guma. It's not something that's optional. It's a complete obligation. It says Mechayiv. But even those who say it's referring to tzitzis altogether, it's not they hold that Techeiles is not a Chiv, but they hold, the Balamu explains, they hold that if we're going to pater him from Techeiles, we have to pater him from Luvon also, because since Techeiles and Luvon are equally obligated, they're both the same in terms of being an obligation. They're both a Chiv. There's no difference between them. So how could we differentiate and say that they're only exempt from Techeiles and not exempt from Luvon? A person would not know to differentiate because there's no difference. They're both the same. They're equal. So you see, even from those who argue and hold that the Gemara is talking about Luvon, but that's not to say that Techeiles isn't a Chiyuv. It's to say that Luvon and Techeiles are equally Mechiyev, and that's why there's no difference between Luvon and Techeiles. So it comes out that all of the Rishonim from this Gemara we see hold that Techeiles is a Chiyuv Gum. And again, not that we need to prove it. It's obvious that it's a Chiyuv Gum. There's no reason to say it isn't. But then we have we have Toysus and Isaiah Neshech. It says the Eibishter says, I'm going to punish somebody who puts on fake tzitzis, which doesn't have a kosher source, kala ilon, which is an indigo plant. He makes the Techeiles out of that. I'm going to punish him because I can tell the difference. So Toysus says, what's the avayre? The avayre is that he wasn't making the mitzvah of Techeiles. So Hashem is going to punish him. The Shagas Aryeh asks a kasha. The Shagas Aryeh says, in his time, there was not Techeiles. Techeiles was not available. So the Shagas Aryeh asks a kasha, why should we wear a talis altogether if we don't have Techeiles? If we don't wear a talis, then we're not mechiyev in anything. If we wear a talis, we're mechiyev to put on luvon and we're mechiyev to put on Techeiles. We don't have Techeiles. So we're violating a mitzvah. Wouldn't it be better just not to wear a talus? That way we're not violating a mitzvah. So he says this. He says, to answer that question, he says, there is a machloikis of Rishonim. What is the chiyuv? When is the chiyuv of putting on Techeiles, of putting on tzitzis? When does that kick in? When is it chal? Is it chal that you're not allowed to put on a beged which doesn't have tzitzis? Or is it that when you wear a beged, that suddenly is mechayev that you have to have tzitzis on the beged? But it's not that you're not allowed to put on the beged before it has tzitzis. It's that when you're wearing it, it is mechayev to have tzitzis. So he says that is the correct pshat. Apparently, that's the way we hold, because otherwise we would not wear a talus that doesn't have chayes. Because you're not, if the emes would be that you're not allowed to put on a talus without tzitzis, you're also not allowed to put on a talus without chayes. You wouldn't be allowed to put it on. But that's not the fact. The fact of the matter is you're allowed to put on the talus, and then you become mechiyev to put on tzitzis. So if you have Techeiles, you put it on. If you don't have Techeiles, you're an oinus. But you never did anything against halucha. There was never an issa to put on the talus. So therefore, we do it, and we put on a talus with only luvan to be at least mekan mitzvah of luvan. And we're not over anything that we don't have Techeiles, because we're an oinus. We don't have the Techeiles, so therefore we're exempt. We're an oinus chachmuna patrai. So again, we see from the Shagasari that when Techeiles is available, like today, Techeiles mutzi, so to put on a talus and not to wear Techeiles is the same as putting on a talus and not putting. Nobody would put on a talus and leave the corners without tzitzis. Everybody knows that's a bitl mitzvah sasa. That's a violation. That's of a mitzvah sasa to omit the kiyum of a mitzvah sasa. Chas v'shulim, nobody would do that. The Shagasari says the same thing would be to put on a talus if you don't put on Techeiles, except if it's not available, you put it because it's honest. But today that it's available, it's a chiyuv guma. So therefore, it also becomes incumbent upon us to determine whether or not this is Techeiles. Brings, you know something, I don't want to study this. I'd rather not know. I'd rather bury my head in the sand. No, because if it's Techeiles, you're mechiyev to wear it, so you better find out what it is. And if because you decided to bury your head in the sand and not to know the halucha, that's not a shoygig, that's a maizid. You have the ability to find out what it is. Not everybody has the ability. Some people aren't capable of researching and passing on. Most people maybe aren't capable. They have to ask their roof. So if their roof happens to be a person who says that it's not Techeiles, then I guess what could they do? But anyone who's capable of researching it, be'emes, with an open mind, they're mechiyev to do so because it's a chiyuv guma. Now let's go into some of the kashas that are asked in connection to the Techeiles. I want to show how the kashas are really not kashas. They don't begin to be kashas. But let me first start off with a little bit of a hakdum. Somebody comes and asks a kasha. He found some source somewhere, who knows where, a rishon or something that I didn't know about. And it seems he has a kasha. If this is Techeiles, then how could we understand what it says over there? So I want to tell you, not every time that a person asks a kasha do I suddenly have to reverse myself and put myself back in limbo of not knowing whether the Techeiles, whether the Murex trunculus is the Chaluzah, and whether my Techeiles is Techeiles or not. You're not mechiyev to do that. Not all questions are matal sufik, create an actual sufik about whether or not this is the Techeiles. There are questions that even if left unanswered, even if I don't know the answers to those questions, still, my proof is conclusive, and I'm mechiyev to wear the Techeiles. We find this idea. We have the Rabbeinu Chananel at the Yosef brings in Choshen Mishpet Siman Samach Beis. The Gemara asks a kasha on a particular halucha, and the Gemara concludes kasha. It's a kasha. The Gemara doesn't answer the kasha. The Gemara says it's a kasha. And the Rishonim, yet even though the Gemara has a kasha, they still paskin this halucha, even though we had a kasha that we didn't know how to answer it. So the Bis Yosef says that the Rabbeinu Chananel brings from the Geonim that we do not cast aside a halucha because it says kasha. Kasha means we have a kasha, we don't know how to answer it, but somebody else might know the answer. When it says in the Gemara tiyivte, the word tiyivte means a retraction. We're taking it back. We're going back. Tiyivte. We're returning it. It's a retraction. So when it says tiyivte, that means we've totally retracted the memory. But when it says kasha, it means I have a kasha. So a kasha could still be the halucha. And this Yosef said that the same thing the Rivosh says and the Rashba says, and it brings a whole thing, that this is the halucha. What does that mean? How could we still hold on to halucha after we have a kasha on that halucha? So let me try to explain this in a practical sense. There are kashas that if somebody would ask a kasha and say, listen, you're telling me that the chaluzoin is the Murex trunculus and it's mechayev to wear Techeiles because the word chaluzoin means a snail. You're also telling me that all of these gedolah poskim said that it means a shnek. So, but you have a mistake because all of these svurim that you're bringing, there is a mistake. They were all somehow printed by somebody who had some sort of a sinister motive, and he can prove to me that this whole thing is one big mistake. And the whole thing, it's all a misprint. It's all somebody who printed all of these sources, and it's wrong. Now, if there's any chance that such a thing could be, obviously it's just an absurd idea which cannot be, isn't, and nobody presented such a kasha. But if somebody would say such a thing genuinely, and he would say that he's sure and that that's the way it is, I would have to consider that, because he is challenging the very premise upon which I'm basing what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're mechiyev to wear the Murex trunculus Techeiles because that's what the word chaluzin means, and that's what these gedolah kadmonim say. And here he's telling me that they don't say that, and it's not what the chaluzin means. So we have to get to the bottom of it. He's asking a kasha which is challenging the very underlying premise of what I'm saying. So such a kasha needs to be addressed. It needs to be determined whether it's true or whether it's not true. But if somebody asks a kasha like this, and this is a kasha that is asked, it's asked even by Talmidei Chacham. How could you say that the chaluzoin is the Murex trunculus? The Murex trunculus, as we know, is a snail, and a snail moves very slowly. The Gemara says that if somebody captures a snail on Shabbos, he's tzayde. There's a melucha on Shabbos capturing a balchai. There cannot be a melucha of tzayde on a snail which hardly moves. It's captured. If you can capture it b'shchi achas with one bend, you bend down and you pick it up. So it's captured before you even start. There cannot be an issa and a melucha of tzayde on a snail. So since it says that there is tzayde by the chaluzan, so the chaluzan is obviously not a snail. So that is a kasha that is not relevant, doesn't need to be addressed, even if I don't know the answer. I do know the answer. The kasha is not a kasha to begin with, as we'll get into it. But even if it is a kasha, I don't have to address that kasha, and I can continue with my knowledge that the Murex trunculus is a kusha source of Techeiles. Why is that? Because he has not been able to challenge my proofs that the word chaluzin means a snail. The word chaluzin certainly means a snail. There's no doubt that the word chaluzin means a snail. So he's asking a kasha, since it means a snail, how is there tzayde? That's a very good question. Maybe it's not a good question, but if it's a good question. So I guess I have a question in Hilchis tzayde. But the question is not a question which could possibly say that the word chaluzin doesn't mean a snail. It certainly means a snail, and we've proven that. Additionally, Rashi says that the word choimet means a snail. I brought the Rashi says clearly the word choimet means a limtze, means a snail. And choimet is one of the shmoyne shrutzim. It's one of the shrutzim that are mentioned in Parashat Shmini, that it says in the Mishnah in Shabbos that if somebody captures it on Shabbos, he's chayav mishum tzayde. So it says clearly that a snail is one of them, chayav mishum tzayde. So I don't know why. I mean, it happens that it doesn't say anywhere in Shulchan Aruch that if an organism goes slowly, there's no tzayde. It says that if something is captured, I guess it's talking about something that can free itself and it can escape, and you've captured it to the point that it's now easy to get to it. So now there won't be tzayde again because you've already done tzayde with it. But a type of an organism which to begin with is easy to get, it doesn't say anywhere that there's no tzayde on that. It also says that if you have an organism which is sick and therefore doesn't move, so there's no tzayde on that. It's the same thing. I guess it's sickness captured it because by nature it's something that moves very quickly. But a type of a creature that doesn't move quickly, nowhere does it say that there's no tzayde on that. It happens to be that there is a Rishon who argues with Rashi, and he says, the Teves read, that the choimet cannot mean a snail. So he's going against many Rishonim who do define the word choimet, as I brought earlier. I didn't bring all of the sources for choimet. I left some of them out, but there are lots of sources for choimet, that the word choimet clearly means a snail. But the Tosafot said it can't mean a snail because then there wouldn't be tzayda. He obviously holds of this svura, even though it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. But it still would not be relevant to the chaluzah, because the Gemara says, it's a Gemara in Baya, and the Masechta is Baya, and the Gemara says that Zeh HaKlal, the Mishnah, Kol HaMechiset Tzayda, Usa, V'sha'ayna Mechiset Tzayda, meant to any organism which needs tzayda, which requires tzayda in order to get it. So it's usa to capture it. Such a creature that doesn't need tzayda, it's mitzvah. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? What's the case of something that needs tzayda? So Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yehuda Mashmid, Kol sha'omer huvay mitzidin itzidani. Any organism that one would say, let's bring some sort of equipment, some sort of a trap, so that we could trap it. That means that it's mechiset tzayda. And Rashi says, what does that mean? You need to find some sort of a tachbila, some sort of a method to catch it. Now the chaluzon is on the bottom of the sea. So either you need scuba diving equipment, which today I guess we have, they didn't have it in those days, but scuba diving equipment is certainly a tachbila. It's not something that one readily can grab. You can't just go to the sea and grab a techeiles, grab a chaluzon. And in fact, what they did was they used to capture them by lowering baskets into the sea, baited, and the chalzoinus over time would slowly go into that basket. They used the trap. It was huvay mitzid and itzidani. So the kasha on many levels doesn't begin to be a kasha. And people ask this kasha. And they say, therefore, because they can't be tzayda on a chaluzon, therefore it's not the chaluzon, therefore it's puta. It's amazing. It's actually astonishing that they don't bother to scrutinize this kasha to see that it's not a kasha. They just, it's like just on the surface, they think it's a kasha, and on the base of that, to be mavatla mitzvah says, it's as I said in the beginning of the discussion. There is a bias. There is a need to conclude. Many people just need to conclude. They must conclude that it's not the chaluz, not chayils, because if it is, then they have to wear it. And obviously, that's something that they would have a hard time with. So the easiest way out is to just kind of find some sort of proof. But these proofs are not proofs. That's one kasha. There's another kasha. People say that they bring a kasha that it says in Kisvay Ari, Arizal, Kabula. So the way they say is that the Arizal says that there cannot be a Techeiles bisman hazeh. We can't have Techeiles when there's no bismikdash. So it can't be that he says that, by the way, because there was Techeiles when there was no bismikdash. The bismikdash was Churev, and you still had the Tanuim that were after the Chol bismikdash and the Amaruim, and the Techeiles was still around until the end of the Tekifa of the Gemara of the Amaruim, until the Rabbunas Avarui. Hundreds of years the Techeiles was around after the Chol bismikdash. So obviously the Ri HaKudish does not say that. But let's quote the words of the Ri HaKudish. I'm not going to quote anything that has kabula diki kavuna, but I'm just going to quote what he speaks around it. He says a kavuna al pi kabula, and then after that he says, therefore, veluchain, because of this kavuna, which is shaykh and has some connection to having a Beis HaMikdash, veluchain hoyenoyig bizman shebeis HaMikdash kam. Therefore, this mitzvah was done, you were mekayim the mitzvah during the times of the Beis HaMikdash. Al tzitzis al luvan, the white tzitzis she'uni noheg moyam that we have today, is he medalid moichen aklilim bebined de ime. He says a kavuna what it is. V'zehi hatam sha'ayin lo nid chayles bizman hazeh. That's the reason that we don't have chayles today. And he writes later that in fact the Iyun that the Techeiles has to be mekayim, the kabula diki kavuna that the Techeiles has to accomplish for the tikkun oilam, exactly what it's accomplishing in the depths of the oilam so yoinim gets accomplished today, but it doesn't get accomplished through our deeds because we're not capable of doing that because we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. He writes that she'ain luni atu koyach she'ayusei hadover al yudaini. We do not have the koyach that this should be done through our actions. So he writes, therefore we don't have Techeiles. Now obviously, what does he mean? Does he mean to say that if we have Techeiles, we shouldn't wear it? Chas v'shulim, how could he say that? How could he be mevatla mitzvah? No poskim say that. Nowhere does it say, there's no gemur, there's nothing. To say that they could be Techeiles in Amchia Fakeh. I've shown you that if there is Techeiles, you are mechiv to wear it. Not only that, but you have there's a certain application, lahalucha, and that is whether you're allowed to wear today a beged of pishton with tzitzis So there are poskim who say that even today we shouldn't wear it. The reason originally that you shouldn't wear it is because if there was Techeiles, somebody might put on Techeiles and somebody might put on an imitation of Techeiles, and it'll be shatnez shaloi b'mukim mitzvah. So, but today that there's no possibility. Today means not today. Today means today before the rediscovery of Techeiles. If there's no possibility of anyone wearing Techeiles, so nobody would wear an imitation either. So there's no fear of anybody being over on the issa of shatnez, because they'll use strings of linen to pat a baggage of linen. They won't use strings of wool, because why would they? It's not that we don't have Techeiles. But there are poskim who say that we should not wear a baggage of pishtan, because the Gzaira is still shaykh, and they quote the Maril says that it's possible that Techeiles will be rediscovered. And the other poskim bring it, the Oilis Tumid, who is a posik that the Magen Avraham brings all the time. And the Malbim, the Artzis HaChaim, is a posik that the Mishnah Berurah brings all the time. They say that the Techeiles could come about. They also bring the Radvaz, that the Radvaz says that it's possible that the Techeiles is around somewhere. It's just we don't know. We don't know how to identify it, but it's possible that it exists. So therefore, the poskim say it could be rediscovered. So clearly, they did not understand. The poskim, the Maril says it could be rediscovered, will be mechiv, will be wearing Techeiles. There's no way to say that the Arizal says that even if we have Techeiles, we don't have to be mekayim a mitzvah in the Torah. It's impossible. Chulil v'chulil. I mean, to say that is kimat kurev tapikosis, that the mitzvah is brutal. We say in the Animamens every day, the Torah will not be changed. There won't be a different Torah. The Torah which says you put on Techeiles is the same Torah that we have today. If we have Techeiles, we have to put it on. So maybe there's a different interpretation of the. Maybe he doesn't mean to say that if you have Techeiles, you don't put it on. Chas v'shulim. Maybe he means to say that we just won't have Techeiles because of this, because of the reason he says. So there will not be Techeiles shelo b'zman habayis. Again, you can't say that because obviously there was Techeiles shelo b'zman habayis. So he obviously doesn't mean to say there cannot be Techeiles. Also, I mean, what do you think is going to happen when the Beis Mikdash gets built? So the same day that they're going to build the Beis Mikdash, that same day they're going to discover the Techeiles and they're going to start dyeing wool and everyone's going to be mechir. What? I mean, wouldn't it come about like a little bit before the binyan Beis Mikdash, as actually the Seifer, one of the Teves Vurim, Yeshiyas Malkoi, actually says that, it could be that before the Ge'ila, Techeiles will re-emerge. It's obviously something we're going to need after the Beis Mikdash is built, after Mashiach comes. So maybe, we're hoping the Mashiach is going to come any day. So now's the time. The Techeiles obviously at some point is going to be rediscovered. So who's to say it's not rediscovered now? But what the Riyah Kodesh is saying, without putting words into his mouth, which those interpretations are clearly doing, he doesn't say there cannot be Techeiles shelo b'zman habayis. He doesn't say that if there's Techeiles, you don't wear it. What he does say is that, why the Rebbeinu Shalom needs all of these kavunas. He needs it because you need it in the world. It's the tikna oilam, all these kavunas for the kavuna, al pi kabula, what's needed to correct whatever is needed, whatever the mitzvahs accomplish in the oilamus u'alyonim. So how could it be that we're living in the world without it? It's something that we need. So the Riyah Kodesh says that it gets this kavuna, it gets accomplished, not through us. We're not capable of doing it anyway. So that's why the Rebbeinu Shalom didn't give us Techeiles for this time, because we anyway are not able to have this kavuna. Kind of explains how it could be that the Rebbeinu Shalom would allow this to happen, that we shouldn't have the mitzvah. That's what he says. He says, therefore, we don't have Techeiles b'zman hazeh because we're not able to be mekayim this kavuna. But he doesn't say we will not have Techeiles b'zman hazeh. That's putting words into his mouth. He doesn't say that if you have Techeiles, you put it. That's putting words into his mouth. Chas v'shulim. And the fact of the matter is, we've proven beyond a doubt that we have Techeiles b'zman hazeh. And the Riyah Kodesh does not say different. Then there's another kasha which people ask, and that is the issue of Mesorah. The issue of Mesorah, where people say you cannot do a mitzvah that we do not have a direct tradition to be mekayim. In other words, this is a mitzvah that hasn't been given over from generation to generation. We didn't receive it from our fathers, from our rebbes. It's something that it's been lost and it's re-emerging now. We're not mekayim a mitzvah that we don't have a tradition how to be mekayim. I mean, besides the fact that all those poskim that I mentioned that say that there's a chash that the Techeiles will come back, it could come back. Obviously, that's not the halucha. The halucha is that you are mekayim a mitzvah. if it reemerges, even though it has been lost for numerous generations. So this whole premise is obviously not correct. I don't know on what basis one would make such a premise. Like, what kind of rule is that? I mean, we have rules in the Torah, and the Torah says all the mitzvahs that you have to do, and we have to do them. So somebody would say, well, even if we know how to be mekayim this mitzvah, we know what the mitzvah is, but it depends how we know. If the way we know how to do the mitzvah is because we heard it from our fathers, our rebbes, then we should listen to the Torah and do what the Torah says. But if the way we know is through other ways, even though we know, we're sure, and there's no question about it, but I don't like the way you know. I don't like the way you found out what the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling you to do. Don't listen to him. You found out in the wrong way. And that's absurd. How could there be such a thing? There cannot be such a thing. There is no such thing. And that's why there were a lot of Gedolim that even when the Radzina discovered his Techeiles, and he said for sure that his Techeiles is Techeiles, and there were a lot of Gedolim who didn't know, but they just said, something, if the Radzina says so, let's put it on, let's wear the Techeiles just in case. They didn't have this idea that you need something has to be given over traditionally from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. There is no such idea in Halucha. When we find sometimes an Iyun of Messiah, we find in the Halucha of Oifis that the Mechaber talks about how there are simunim to know which oifis, which types of poultry, which fowl are kusha. So there are 3 simunim to be able to tell what's kusha. And then you also have to know that it's not a doiris, that it's not a predator. So then there are another 2 simunim. And the Mechaber says if you have these simunim, you're allowed to eat it. And the Marshal is Michael even more. And he says that you don't even need all the 5 simunim. The original 3 simunim are enough. You could eat it. The Prichudish Paskins like the Mechaber. There are poskim who say you can go and eat it. The Ramu says, no, we do not eat birds without a Messiah, unless we have a tradition where somebody knows its identity because they've been shown this bird from somebody previous who knew the identity. You have to have a Messiah. So what do we have here? Why? Because it says, why does the Ramu say you have to be mach? We have 5 simunim. It says because it might be that you might make a mistake. Even after the simunim, maybe it's a predator. We found that there are certain birds which have these simunim, and they're not completely conclusive. They could still be a predator. So then it's not kusha. So it's obviously not it's not a species which is kusha. So this doesn't prove it enough. So we have here that simunim, a lot of poskim hold you're allowed to rely on it even to be Michael and to eat something, which we don't have to eat it. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to eat this bird. It's not a mitzvah, it's not a chiyuv, but it's you're allowed to. Comes the Ramu and says, no, we should not eat it because, first of all, why should we be Michael? There's no chiyuv to eat it. And if we would eat it, we would turn out to be wrong. Then it would turn out that we're being oiva on an issa. We're eating something which is not kosher. So you want to take that idea and flip it and say that we should be Michael and not do a mitzvah out of a lack of Messiah. Here we have poskim that say that we could be Michael and eat something which is a rishis and not be concerned of a issa, even though we don't have a Messiah. The Ramu says we should be machim and we should be concerned of a issa. So you're going to take that to say that, therefore, we need a Messiah and we should be Michael and not be Mekayim a mitzvah when it has been clearly identified with proofs? So, in fact, this would be similar. Let's say somebody finds a bird, which is kusha according to all of the simunim, but we don't eat it because we don't have a Messiah, so the Ramu says we don't eat it. So we have a mitzvah of shaliach haken. If you want to take the eggs or the young birds, you have to send away the mother. Would we be allowed to take the eggs of this bird that we have simunim that it's kusha, but we don't have a Messiah? Of course not, because it's probably kusha. We're just machma not to eat it, but we can't be Michael and say that you don't have to be mekayim shalach like sikram elabunim. There is actually a chief in Minchas Eluzah who goes through this shal. The reason he asks the question to begin with, it's totally not a question. Of course, we won't be Michael. But it says ve'es habunim tikach loch. So he says maybe it has to be the kind of bird that you'll actually end up being able to eat. And since for whatever reason it is, we won't eat it, so maybe the halucha doesn't apply. But he says no, if it's kusha, it applies. So here we are. We have Techeiles. We've proven Techeiles. Someone says, don't be mekayim the mitzvah. We're going to be Michael and we're going to not do a mitzvah, even if it would be wrong, there would be no issa. It's not like eating taif and a bird. I mean, the Yeshiyas Malkai, who doesn't agree with the Techeiles of the Radzina, says there's no harm in wearing it. You don't have to fight with somebody who put it on his tzitzis already, because it lo yahayel, so it's it's no worse than tzitzis that are not dyed at all. It's still kusha as tzitzis as luva. So there's no downside. So on such a thing, you're going to say that you need a Messiah. This idea of a Messiah is brought in the name of the Bais Halevi. And the Bais Halevi is quoted in a letter that the Radzina had received. I don't know who wrote the letter, whether it was the Bais Halevi himself or a shliach. It says this. It says something totally different. It says that you're identifying the chaluzan as being the cuttlefish. That is a type of a creature that we've had all the time and has never been lost. So if you can explain to me why, over all of the generations, they did not have Techeiles, what did you discover that wasn't known all along? Either you discovered the actual species, the actual chaluzan, or you discovered the way of dying. And tell me, what is it that you know how to do that we didn't know all along? If you can tell me that, then we will in fact be obligated, the Bais Halevi. He agrees he'll be obligated, but you have to explain, because if there is no answer to that question, then the fact that they didn't wear it all along means that they understood that the cuttlefish is not the chaluzan, because otherwise they would have worn it. So by that version of the words of the Bais Halevi, the way it's quoted in the letter that the Bais Halevi sent to the Radzina, obviously that doesn't apply to the Murex Trunklers. We know very well what happened, that there was a decree by the Roman emperors that nobody's allowed to wear Techeiles, and then over the generations, the entire art of dyeing with chaluzin got lost, as the Radva says, because they discovered cheaper ways of producing blue. Because obviously the color, I know there was the discussion earlier in this event about whether the Techeiles that the Iyun used for tzitzis is the same as the Techeiles that the Goyim used. Obviously, the Radvaz holds it was. He says that the fact that in the industry they no longer made Techeiles, so therefore Iyun also don't have Techeiles, because it's the same Techeiles, and it became a totally lost art, because now we have cheaper and easier ways of producing the blue dye. So therefore it's gotten lost. We know exactly why it has gotten lost. First, there was a decree from the emperors, and we weren't allowed to wear it. And that's what actually brought also in the Ben Yehuda, on the Gemara, he says that there was a decree that the Yidden were not allowed to wear Techeiles. He learns it from the Gemara. I'm not going to get into that. And we know historically there was a decree on all kinds of Techeiles, all kinds of purpura dye. And that's why it got lost. It's very simple. So Bais Halevi would ask his question, what exactly happened and why did you reemerge now? What did you find out that we didn't know all along? We have a very clear answer to that question. There is another version of the words of the Bais Halevi, and that's something which is known in the family of the descendants of the Bais Halevi. In one of the Sfurim, which brings this idea from one of the descendants of the Bais Halevi, he writes this, and I'll quote it. She'ain rayis v'svuras yecholos lohichiach shim dova. Proofs and the svuras logic cannot prove anything. B'mile the shayche lemesoiras shel sha'alovichu yagaitu. In something which applies to a tradition which comes under the category of sha'alovichu yagaitu. Ask your father, he'll tell you. Which means a mesoira from generation to generation. Sham, in those types of things. In other words, not every mitzvah is like that, but there are types of haluchas that are shaykh to the union of Messiah. There, ein hasvura machriya. A svura cannot be the deciding factor. Ki im, only ha-Messiah atzma. Only an actual tradition to say, kach ru yovas, that's what the father saw, v'kacho in hagit, and that's what we have to do. Now, this is brought in connection to the family of the descendants of the Bais Halevi. Bring this in connection to Techeiles. Let me say this: if there would be a cipher that would say, a cipher from the earlier Rishon that would say, and we have such svura, a cipher says that it is the Murex Trunculus, it is the Purpura, that's the Chaluzin of the Techeiles, got lost, and if anyone can find it and figure out how to die with it and everything, then that's what was used with Techeiles. That would certainly be a Messiah. That's somebody identifying it. I mean, we have to speak to him directly. What about on Zoom? I mean, is that good? And if we find it in a cipher, it's not good. what he says is, what this statement is, what do you mean things that are shaykh to sha'al avicho yagayt? What does that mean? That means that when something needs a definition, we have a word, chaluzon. The word chaluzon has to be defined. So how am I going to know the definition of a word? The only way to know such a thing is by tradition. So someone's going to try to figure it out. This must be what the word chaluzon means. Because it says that the chaluzon is like the sea, it's like a fish, it's like this, it grows, the skin grows with it. Then, something, that must be the definition of the word chaluzon. The word chaluzon is a word that needs a definition. When you need a definition, it's not something that you can prove by proofs. It's something that you either know the definition or you don't know the definition. So how do you know a definition? Because it's been given over traditionally. It's a language, it's been used, it's a word. So that is the Messiah of it. But if you don't have that, then it's just trying to figure out and guess what could possibly be the definition of the word chaluzon. So he says things that are shaykh to sha'al avicho yagayt. There are certain things that need to be identified, and without a tradition, you can't identify them. So that was relevant to the chaluzon of the Radzina, because on the basis of certain simunim, he decided that a cuttlefish is the definition of the word chaluzon. We do not prove what the definition of the word chaluzon is from proofs and from simunim, because that would be, some sort of a svura. We have the definition of the word chaluzon, as I have discussed earlier. We know what the word chaluzon means. It's written in Sfurim, it's written in Rishonim, it's written in Achronim. We have Achronim who say that the Pir is the Techeiles. That's a Messiah. That is Gedoyli Yisruel clearly identifying and pinpointing and saying this is what it is. The Beis HaLevi would certainly agree to that by all versions of the statement of the Beis HaLevi. So with this, I want to conclude that, again, it's important. I think the most important thing in this discussion, the actual proofs that the chaluzah and the actual discussion, it speaks for itself. I think anyone who looks into it objectively and hasn't made up his mind before he began will certainly and does certainly come to the conclusion that this is the chaluzah and this is the Techeiles. So what we really need to do is we need to let down our guard and allow ourselves to have an open mind and an open heart. It's a beautiful thing that Yidden don't want to do things different than their fathers and that their Rebbes did. That's beautiful, and it's the way it should be. But there are certain things that if the Rebbes would have had, they would have done it too. The fact is they didn't have it. There were times, and there were Gedol Yisruel who lamented the fact that they can't be Mekayim this mitzvah. And if they would have been able to be Mekayim, they would have, as we knew, a lot of Gedolei Yisruel, we know, tried to be Mekayim with the Radzina's Techeiles, even though they weren't convinced, but the Radzina said so. Certainly, the Gedolei Yisruel, our forefathers, our Rebbes, would have been Mekayim. We're not deviating from our tradition by being Mekayim a mitzvah which we have available to us, which is something which is it's a kaile, is it Yushan, Chudash Mula Yushan. It looks like it's a new vessel, but it's carrying old material from the Torah, from the times of the previous generations when they were Mekayim the mitzvah. So therefore, we should be Mekayim the mitzvah, and through that we'll be Zoiche to all the sigillis of the mitzvah. We'll be Duvik Bashem. It says that if you look at the tzitzis, and a lot of Rishonim, the Ramban and other Mefoshim say it refers specifically to the Techeiles, because the Techeiles reminds us of the Kisah Kuved. Is a Charatem is called mitzvah Hashem. It's a reminder if a person has a problem. What should I do? I have the Eitz HaHara is giving me such a hard time. So the Torah gives an Eitz. Just look at your Techeiles. You'll remember all the mitzvahs. You'll do them. The Techeiles is such a mitzvah which enriches us to be Mekayim the whole Torah. The Eibishter should help us that we should be able to be Mekayim the mitzvahs.
Shkoyach Rabbi Halberstam, thank you. Wow. Amazing. I know that we've gone a little bit over. There's still a few questions if the Rav would be available for a few questions after.
Yes.
Okay, great. So
I will know the answers to them.
Okay, listen, I'm not expecting you to know the answers. I mean, sometimes saying I don't know is also a good answer.
Right.
So, okay, one question by Abe Lederer. He asked this in the beginning. The Pnei Yehoshua in Bav Metzia, page 61, writes, Midiraisa, it is mutter lechatchila to wear a talis that doesn't have Techeiles. Tosfos Menachos, page 41, writes that a talis that has only one min would be ksher. Wouldn't this imply that it is legitimate to claim that Techeiles is merely a mitzvah min mufchar?
Okay, I will say that he had asked me this question before. It's
Ah,
not this time. And I answered it. It's hard to get into it right now because it's a little bit technical in terms of understanding the Pnai Yeshia. The Pnai Yeshia cannot mean that it's not a chiyuv because it's all the sources of the Gemura and the Rishonim say that it's a chiyuv. But just in a nutshell, the Pnai Yeshia, to the best of my recollection, if a person owns a beged that does not have Techeiles, is it necessarily a violation of the mitzvah of Techeiles? Because then he will wear that beged one day that doesn't have Techeiles. The answer is no, because not always is it an issa to put on a beged that doesn't have Techeiles. For instance, at a time that Techeiles is not available, or if a person would find himself in a place where he doesn't have Techeiles, it's impossible to get Techeiles. So as we mentioned from the Shagas Aryeh, you put on a talis and you wear luva and you're mekayim at least that mitzvah that we could be mekayim. So the actual putting Techeiles onto a beged, putting luva onto a beged and not putting on Techeiles is not yet a violation necessarily of the mitzvah of Techeiles, because there could be a circumstance where he would be allowed to wear that beged, except that if you put on kala ilon, that's deception. That's going to cause somebody to wear such a beged even in a time where Techeiles is available, because he's going to think he has Techeiles. Then he will be mevatel the mitzvah of Techeiles. In light of this hakdumah, if you read the Pnai Yeshia, you will see that what he means to say is that it is not necessarily a violation. It is not always a violation to wear a talis without Techeiles. Therefore, just merely preparing such a beged is not a issa. In terms of the Teves and Menuches, it's too lengthy and too complicated, but it is a misrepresentation of the Teves and Menuches. And additionally, it cannot be. I've already shown that all of the Rishonim say it's a chiyuv goma.
okay, very good. So that's one question. Another question comes from Reb Shmuel Yitzchak Eisenberg. He asks, and by the way, there's another person who actually touched on the top on this, that no speaker spoke about Safek Medirais L'Chimra, so maybe this could be part of a much larger topic. So Shmuel Yitzchak Eisenberg asks, does Safek Medirais L'Chimra, does that apply to Techeiles? My understanding has always been that we only say L'Chimra when we know after the fact that we fulfill the mitzvah with 100% certainty, such as if we don't remember we said benching, we bench again because now we know we fulfilled the mitzvah. By Techeiles, are we at 100% certainty, or are we only at 99.9%?
Okay, so let me answer that on several levels. First of all, we are at 100% certainty because 99.9% is 100% certainty. There is a hakdumah of the Milchamis, the Ramban in his hakdumah to the Sefer Milchamis Hashem. He writes that the Torah is not mathematics, where things get proven like mathematically, where something is clearly, it's black and white. The way we build a halucha is when something seems to be the halucha, then that is certainly the halucha. We have acheram lahatos in the Torah. We have all kinds of means. It's not that way. It's not like a mathematical equation. So he says that's something we apply bain lechimre, bain lekille, even to administer din nefushis. We go with such a thing as certainty. So when we have these rayas are mechayiv. That's one. Additionally, the Chazoin Ish in the Sefer Masa Ish is quoted to have said in connection to the Chaluzin of the Radzina that even if there would only have been a tzel tziloy shel sufik, which in our language means a shadow of a doubt, that the Chaluzin of the Radzina is correct, all of the Gedolim of his time would have been mechiv to wear it. Only because of a tzel tziloy shel sufik, that would have been enough to be mechayev all the gedolim of the times of the Radzina to wear the Techeiles. And the fact that they didn't is because they knew that there isn't even a shadow of a doubt. It totally is wrong. There's no chance that this is the Chaluz. And as I mentioned from the Yeshiyas Malkoi, he says it's only a hashur. It's nothing more than a guess. You can just as easily point to any organism in the sea and say that's what it is. It's a blindfolded guess. Then let's get to the question of Sufik Derais Lechem. Yes, there is such a shitta. It is not the Ikke shitta lahalucha that we were only Mekayim Sufik Derais Lechimre if after the Kiyim we know for sure we were Mekayim it. We find that if we have an Esrig, which is a Sufik, if it's Mirkiv or not, we have all times that we have a mitzvah that it's a Sufik, the Poskim say you should do the mitzvah Misufik, even though at the end of it maybe you weren't Mekayim the mitzvah, but we still do the mitzvah. We find this many times in Halucha. So it is not the normative Halucha. There is such a shitta, but it isn't the normative Halucha. The Ikke shitta is that Sufik Derais Lechimre applies even when we remain with the suffix afterwards. But again, that's all not relevant because we don't have a suffix, we have a vadai. As Rabbi Belsky said once when he was asked, someone asked him, somebody was trying to say that it's not Techeiles, said, do you think after all that I said, somebody tried to build an argument that it's not correct, do you think after all that I said there's still a chance that that the Murex trunculus is the Chaluzin of the Techeiles? And his answer was, it's a vadai. In other words, I don't think it's a chance. I think it's a vadai. It is certainly the Techeiles. And as such, the whole discussion of Sufik Derais Lechimre is not relevant.
Shkoyach. Next question is from Josh Fogel. He asks, Messiah is used in other places for halacha. For example, outside of Eretz Yisrael, most poskim write that Chadash is Asur Min HaTorah, which is, we know the Chassan Sofer basically hijacked for his own attack on the
Melitza.
Huh?
He used it as a melitza, as Gedolim sometimes did.
Exactly, but in this case, outside of Yisrael, Chadash refers to the grains, right? So Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. However, one opinion writes that it is allowed. The Messiah has been to eat Chadash outside of Eretz Yisrael. Also, this Techeiles is very expensive, and how can you say that people should purchase it? Isn't this Bal Tashchus of people's money?
Well, then it's Baltashchus to buy a Lila and Esrig, and it's Baltashchus to build a Sikkah. Every mitzvah is Baltashchus because it costs money. I mean, what is Baltashchus? It's Baltashchus to eat, actually, because when you eat, you're taking perfectly good food and ruining it. It goes into your stomach and it gets all ruined. That's like, I knew somebody, actually, who used to say, you asked him, "Was machst du?" So he said, "Ich mach kal ya essen." What are you doing? How are you doing? He said, "Oh, what I'm doing is I'm destroying food." It was a kind of a humble way of describing his existence. So you say that doing a mitzvah is baltashchis. I don't like saying that. It's not nice to say that. It's a mitzvah. It's not baltashchis. I guess the reason you're saying that, to be dan lekavschis, and in all fairness, which is certainly what you mean, is that you don't believe that it is really the Techeiles. So therefore, if it's only just a possibility, a little suffix, so then maybe we shouldn't spend the money on that. I mean, that's probably what you mean. But it's not so. This is the Techeiles, and it's a chiyuv, and therefore you have to put it on. In terms of what was the first thing he mentioned? Just to get back to that.
I'm just going to repeat the question. So he said that Messiah is used in other places for halacha, for example.
Yes, he talked about chudash, right? So he talked about chudash. So in connection, chudash is a big discussion, and it's famous. The Bach was mata chudash because of his feksfaike, which is there's no way that we can. That's ridiculous. You're telling me that we were mevat, that we eat chudash, which is usa, because of a tradition which goes against halucha. Chas v'shulam. The Bach said that Chudash ben Chitzlowitz is mitta because it's a Sfek and Haluch on a Sfek is that it's mitta. Today, many poskim say that Sfek is no longer there because one of the Sfeikis of the Sfek is that we don't know when these grains are from. Maybe they're old, maybe they're not Chudash. So that's part of it. That's part of what goes into the equation. And since today we do know and we're able to know and every batch is identified, the heter of the Bach is no longer relevant. And many and most poskim today know that and aser Chudash.
Very good. Very good. I have one. I'm sorry that we've already gone a little bit over, or more than a little bit over. I have a couple of questions, a couple of personal questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned you were talking about the linguistics about how we know that that chilozim means snail. First of all, I found out, interestingly enough, a little while back, that just like limtza, right, limtza means snail in Old French. In Italian, even today, the word lumaca also means snail. So lumaca and limtza sounds very, very, very similar. And all European languages are connected. But with modern French, right, limetz, more accurately, does not mean a snail, but it means a slug. And escargot, as we know, is a snail. That's considered to be a delicacy in France. I'm curious to know, because you mentioned you saw this in an Old French dictionary. I'm curious to know if you have the Old French dictionary on hand, so that we can see where the word limtza translates as a snail. Also another thing, shablul, more accurately means a land snail as opposed to a sea snail. So should we be concerned about this diuk?
Okay, so I don't know what you're saying about shablil, that it means a land snail and not a sea snail. I will say I don't know.
Okay.
In terms of the difference between a snail that has a shell, a slug with a shell, and a slug without a shell, I am aware of that. And it seems that over time, the differentiation became more defined. It used to be that these two words were used interchangeably. And that's, it seems to be indicated that way in my old dictionary. It'll take me a couple of minutes to find it. If there would be another speaker after me, I'll be able to look for it while that's going on. But it seems that, I don't know if there is. But yeah, in the old French dictionary, it does say that generally, there's a difference between limtze and limtzon. And generally, one of them, I don't remember which is the one and which is the other, but one of them usually refers to one with a shell and one not, and it's not always used that way. And that's something that has developed later, and originally it was more freely used interchangeably.
Okay, very good. Next, sorry, so one or two more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
You mentioned about Purpura being referred to as the actual type of shnek. Is there? Do you see if there's a difference between the Greek word purpura and the other Greek word porphyros? Because according to the Woodhouse English Greek dictionary, porphyros literally means the color purple as opposed to the actual creature.
Okay, so I don't really know Greek. And I guess maybe perfuros could be that which is derived from purpura. And we know that just like purpirin and persinen, right? So purpirin means Techeiles, as we heard about the ravye. It means something that is derived from the purpura. And the same way, maybe purpiros also is that way. I'm not that much of a linguist to be able to tell you. But certainly the word purpura means the snail.
Okay, and last but certainly not least, you were talking about how when the Raziners came up with their cuttlefish theory, that Rav Poskim, Rav Gedolei Yisrael, did not accept that as the chilazim. I know that with Lubavitch in particular, with the new Techeiles, you have a handful that actually are wearing, but the vast majority don't, because they feel very strongly on the Rebbe Rashab, rejecting the first one. But supposedly with the Rebbe Rashab, his issue was more so that he simply could not believe, or he could not understand how this chilazim that the Razina Rebbe found, how that was it, because it looked completely different from what he understood. Is the Rebbe able to elaborate on that?
I don't really know much about that. I did once read somebody who wrote, someone who's a proponent of the Techeiles that we have, and he wrote about what the words of the Rashab, and he explained that the Rashab would not be against this Techeiles, but I can't get into any specifics because I don't know.
Okay, very good. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Halberstam, for giving your time and answering these very relevant questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with regards to further research, again, I mean, there's actually been quite a few questions that came in that I've unfortunately not been able to answer, but but definitely these questions will be addressed at a later point in time by emails. So don't worry, there's not going to be any question that's going to be unanswered. Bli neder. Yeah. For further research on Techeiles, there are a few resources. There's a few websites which are fantastic. The first one to look at is Techeiles. This is the Amotad, the organization that began commercially producing it in 1991. There are over 800 library articles, and these guys are based out of Ma'ale Adumim. The next website to check out is Chez Chabura. It's based in Lakewood, New Jersey. Headlined by Rabbi Yecheskel Toprovich, Rabbi Yisrael Barkin, who's a nephew of Rabbi Chaim Yisrael Belsky, Rabbi Yisrael Rosenberg, and many others. Over there you have a ton of resources in terms of in terms of the Rabbanim that are pro Techeiles and anti Techeiles, and also there are videos in terms of shiurim at Techeiles, and also how the process is made from that end. The Techeiles Foundation. Our first speaker was Dr. Yisrael Zeiderman. So this is his personal website. On there are research materials from his findings, and it keeps getting updated. And at the risk of self-promoting, bluefringes.com is a website which I created and actively run. So in there are notable rabbanim and also and people wearing the Techeiles. So you'd be surprised about some of the people that are wearing. Some of which I was able to get pictures of, so people can actually see that there are rabbanim that really do hold this Techeiles. There are over 30 tying methods, and also there are some fantastic archaeological finds, which some of which you just won't find. I mean, you'll be able to find some elsewhere, but you won't find these in such an organized manner. So huge thanks to first of all HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Also to Chaim Chopper for funding the initial aspects of the event. This event has been streamed courtesy of StreamYard, also through Zoom, and he's also provided a certain amount of advertising that went towards this event. Baruch Sherman Techeiles for the intro video, allowing this event to stream on the social media channels, and also being able to get Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky initially to speak some words of chizuk, and other advertising efforts. I also want to thank each speaker for donating his time and effort, which definitely is not cheap, and has been and aside from that, has been invaluable in terms of spreading our knowledge and awareness of Techeiles in some ways which has not been discussed before in such a forum. And lastly, everyone that took it upon themselves to spread news about this event. You were all very much a part of this, and that's basically it. I wish everybody bracha and tzlacha and everything they do, and we may come to do future events like this. But I mean, this was definitely a good start to trying to get speakers from all over the world using this wonderful streaming technology to be able to speak firsthand, and everybody being able to hear from the source about various issues regarding the sugya. So I wish everybody bracha v'atzlacha and all the best. I'm gonna end the broadcast now.